What's going on, everybody? Super Tuesday. Here we are. Oh, such a big one tonight. The Yatsubusa Elm. We started off talking about pruning elm, summer pruning, handling. It was like, oh, this is gonna be great. We're gonna talk about elm refinement. And then I was like, gosh, all this pruning feels like we should wire it, you know? So then it was like, we're pruning, it's like we're gonna wire it. And then it was like, well, if we're gonna wire it, we might as well wire it on a live stream. So here we are, but we had all the pruning that we'd already done. So we decided to team them all up and give you a double dose of magic tonight. Lucky you and thankful us. Got Ira on the mic tonight.
What's up?
Josh Sales up in the mothership. Lonnie and Jesus on the detail cams. It's a full boat. Adam Johnson in the workshop. Darlene's down there. Okay, here we go. So again, and let me just set the tone for this, right? Midsummer, we call in the Northern Hemisphere where we're at in the Pacific Northwest and in general as far as daylight length is concerned. Sorry, I've got flies flying all around me. Okay, as daylight length is concerned from zone 9 down, zone 9 down. Zone 10 starts to get into like some semi or subtropical, okay? But from zone 9 down, we call July midsummer. And the reason for calling it midsummer is it is a trigger of daylight length and temperature that leads to the pruning of some of our more heat-tolerant, warmer, aggressive growing broadleaf deciduous varieties. And as a trigger, understanding the timing prior to that onset of August 15th, which is really the daylight turn that starts to shift foliar to vascular, even though you'll still get foliar growth after that, the primary focus of energy and resources is into vascular. This July period of time, we've talked about it on the live Q&As, we've talked about it on the forum Q&As, is the last kind of time that we can really handle trees that are hardening off, a second partial defoliation pruning on a trident, potential second partial defoliation and pruning on a wisteria. We look at elm at this time of year as a really opportune time to be handling elm, working on elm, pruning elm for refinement as that last time that we can handle ramification, get another push that will harden off and give us twigging as leaves drop in the fall. So understand that as we move into the pruning, we're gonna walk you through the considerations of stronger areas, how we handle them. When we come back, we're gonna dig into a few weaker areas to see how we balance the leaf mass, and then we're gonna dive into show wiring on a broadleaf deciduous to get this thing into shape for the Pacific Bonsai Expo coming this November. Take a look, we'll catch you on the flip side and dig into that final touch of weak branch pruning and the wiring process. Enjoy. I look to the summer with my elms to do both primary structural pruning as well as secondary branch selection as well as tertiary refinement pruning, because each of those moments in the development, evolution, and maintenance of an elm allows the tree enough time with the accumulated branch mass of the tree to be able to push out its leaf mass, recover its resources, but not get too strong, too thick to sort of blow out or destroy the proportions of the branching as they exist in an elm. Now, there definitely could be nuances to this, depending on how you're fertilizing and when your spring begins, i.e. warmer areas that have a much warmer spring where we see elms really explode with growth, where you might need to do this work a little bit sooner. But I will caution you on that. I will caution you on that, and here's why. As we get an elm into a containerized environment, as we go from a primary structural development to expanding of the secondary scaffolding, and then as we move into a plethora, a copious expansion of tertiary ramification, we technically should see our elm's behavior shift from this developmental, young, rambunctious, sort of energy-filled tree into a little bit more widespread secondary, still coarse, but not as vigorous, not as out of control, secondary scaffolding development into, you know, when you go from 5 developmental branches to 50 secondary branches to 3,000 tertiary branches, that distribution of energy that we see in the confined environment of the container has got to be diluted or distributed, dispersed across those growing number of tips. And when we get to this point, Even though I'm fertilizing this elm as vigorously as I've ever fertilized it in its life as a bonsai, the simple fact that this container size has not changed from the beginning of the build and its initial repot into where it is at today. Yes, it has been repotted once or twice in that progress of the root system, right, reflecting that expansion of the apical region, but we just have so many more tips that this root system's energy and the nutrition that I'm providing are distributed across. Now, if you start to get too much vigor in a tree that you're trying to refine, what do? Pull back on fertilization. Your fertilization strategy has got to be compatible with your pruning strategy, has got to be compatible with what you're trying to accomplish in terms of the stage of the tree and where it is at. But for a tree of this size and scale, just to maintain enough energy, enough metabolism, enough capacity to push all of these tips into actual foliar presence, right, which some of these tips only have 2 leaves, 3 leaves per tip. We're going to check that and balance that energy today, but some of these leaves have got more than that where we're going to have to prune, and that means that we need to fertilize and nutrition to get that kind of growth. Let me just show you once around. Obviously, the lower branches are going to be slightly shaded out. We have to rotate this tree very, very consistently over the growing season, and we do see that this backside has been, I think, a little bit exposed to shade for a little bit too long, which leads it to be a little sparser. You can see the favorable, sustainable design branches that are really proliferating the upper canopy, doing a good job. But all in all, for not having been touched at all this year, we see a very even distribution of energy, or I would say a relatively even distribution of energy, interior, exterior, top to bottom. And now we're at this point where we say, listen, we have gotten energy positive, we have gotten energy reaccumulation, we've waited on our elm. We've waited on our elm far past, we're talking 6 weeks ago, we partially defoliated, maybe even 8 weeks ago now, depending on where you're at, we partially defoliated and pruned our highest water mobility broadleaf deciduous, which was the Japanese maple. We worked through some of our moderate water mobility deciduous, like our hornbeams, like our beeches, like our stewardias, like our wisterias, right? And now we're starting to enter this summer phase where we've done all of our developmental pruning, we've done all of our secondary selection, and now we are at that refinement level with this tree that has just so much to give and has evolved so much. Now, before we dive into this, I just want to walk you through where this tree started. This is a Yatsubusa elm, which is to suggest it's not a cork bark, it's a genetic mutation of a cork bark that creates an even different characteristic and perspective. Almost a seiju elm size of leaf. Very, very small, tiny leaf that naturally exists. You can see some areas of the tree where the leaves are getting empowered by the increased health that this has over in this area, but for the most part, notice how those leaves are slightly bigger in that really vigorous shoot that could be a reversion to potentially the initial genetic, but I'm guessing that's just a really strong state of health on that branch. But a small leaf, a very rugged bark, and this was a piece of mother stock in the Willamette Valley for 82 years. When Randy Knight and I dug these out of that propagation nursery, cuttings taken off of it every year, kept in a relatively compact form, 82 years before Randy Knight and I dug the 6 Yatsubusa elms out of that propagation nursery in the Willamette Valley in 2010. So now you stack on another 12 years. We're talking about, this is a 94-year-old tree with a traced history of propagating almost all of the Yatsubusa elm that exist across North America and potentially even into Europe, right, as a genetic cultivar. Very, 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 very special tree, okay? Now I want to walk you through initially after collection in the wood box, the expansion of the foliar mass, and note when you look at these pictures, the size of the canopy to the proportion of the trunk. Each of the Yatsubusa elms that we dug in, we air layered off the big major upper canopy portions that gave us good solid trunk, very mature bark, and branching to create medium and shohin sized trees. You'll see in the second image, now we start to have a tree that has all of those air layers removed, the structural cuts made to reduce this to a proportion that maximizes the parent trunk and root system. Okay, we see that tree styled and evolving in image number 3 in the first gallery shot that we ever took of this tree at Mirai. You then see Chris Hornbecker's iteration as a studio shot taken in 2021. And now we join this tree in the studio in 2022. Quite an evolution over the past 12 years of a tree that was very much taken down to a stump and then rebuilt as a bonsai, right? So you see the techniques work, and again, the timing, the scope of work from primary, secondary to tertiary. It's exciting to now be with this and get to do our annual maintenance of a refined Chinese elm in this mid portion of summer where it's fully hardened off, it's in an energy positive, and we now get to balance the strength, okay? I'm gonna go one more time around just to give you a good solid perspective. We saw some of the strength discrepancies. Now, when we get into refinement pruning of a Chinese elm, it's very effortless to say, oh, okay, we're gonna take any of these elongated pieces that have elongated beyond 2, 3, 4 leaves, and we're gonna cut them back to 2 leaves. But we recognize there are areas that are slightly weaker, there are areas that haven't elongated as much, and we may need to, for the sake of density, for the sake of photosynthetic mass in that area, we may need to leave a few more elongated shoots to give that region of the tree the strength it needs to balance out its photosynthetic productivity and transpirational load with the stronger branches that have far more of those resources flowing. So let's just dive in first and foremost to fundamentals. Fundamentally looking at this, I don't want to let these branches elongate. This does, when we get a tree this big, start to become fairly tedious work. But I'm going to be coming in here recognizing that the first leaf that an elm produces, and the first leaf that a majority of our broadleaf deciduous trees produce, is going to largely not have a bud at the base of it. We say, listen, you cut an elm back to the first 2 leaves. We have to recognize the first leaf does not count, and sometimes the second leaf does not count because the buds and the crotches of these are not developed enough to take over that load. So then we start to say, okay, I don't have a bud here. As I observe, I don't have a bud here. The first time that I see a bud in the crotch of an elm is actually on the 3rd leaf. That happens to be the first leaf that shows a full-size leaf. I'm going to save my first 2 full-size, fully formed leaves. 1, 2, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to take off. And when I take that off, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leaves that I'm cutting off of that piece, cutting it down to 2 fully formed leaves, and I had 2 primordial leaves that did not have buds in that crotch. Let me show you again. I've got these very, very small, minimal, 2 very, very small, minimal, no buds in the crotch leaves. I've got 2 fully formed, and I'm going to take that back. This starts to become the pruning mechanism that we're leaning on to adjust and hold back the strongest areas of the tree. These are areas where we say, listen, there is density here. There is a lot of branching here. This is how we go ahead. We keep that shape from rapidly expanding. We hold back that ramification from destroying the tight, compact level of refinement that we've achieved. This is really the maximum degree that we would reduce an area of the tree to. Now, typically we say, listen, I'm going to reduce the strongest area to the weakest significant branch. This is common in Japanese black pine plucking. This is common in partial defoliation of our other broadleafs, where we're taking the number of leaves, trident maple, plucking to the weakest significant branch. Or we're saying, listen, any of our larger leaf varieties, cutting down by 2/3, right? Japanese maple. We're going to be taking 1 of every 2 leaves off in the strongest, and we're going to be cutting the tips off of the leaves that are remaining. In the medium, 1 of every 2 leaves. In the weaker, we're not taking any leaves off. That's that same distribution of surface area, right? When we start to talk about a linden, we talk about a beech, 2/3 of every strong area and moderate area, and then we start to say in the weaker areas, we leave in the whole leaf mass. Okay, well in a Chinese elm, especially one, a seiju, a yatsubusa, one that has smaller leaves, or a highly mature refined piece, when I start to look into these areas that are lower down, that are on the interior, I'm going to be leaving longer junctions of leaves that have 4, 5, 6 leaves on them to balance with the density of the stronger areas that are occurring around them that have far more light penetration, okay? So contrary to a majority of the cadence of work where we start with the weakest branch and then we learn from that, we build our reference of density, I'm going to start with the strongest areas, and I'm going to take the strongest areas of my Chinese elm down to those first 2 functional leaves at every elongating shoot. making sure I've got mature buds in the crotches, and I'm going to reference that density of the strongest areas to be able to leave what I need to leave in the weaker areas to elevate their strength, catch them up to the stronger areas, and balance the energy across the tree. If that means having longer branches in weaker areas to get that done, so be it. That is what we need in terms of leaf mass to balance that energy. So I'm going to spend some time working through this stronger area here. I'm cutting every single elongated piece down. Unless I want length, unless I want thickness, unless I want further development, I'm going to be cutting every single elongated shoot in my stronger areas down to the first 2 functional leaves with a bud in the crotch. Let's revisit this after we've gone through this process, take a look at the density of some of the stronger areas, and that is going to prepare us to balance the energy of the weaker areas and look at how do we manage moderate and weaker areas in relation to those stronger pieces. Okay, so we've pruned this section here, and of course it's tough to see in terms of the greater perspective because we're talking about taking 3 or 4 leaves off of every tip, but I wanted to zoom back in and I wanted to orient you to the other aspects of pruning that we are also addressing in this pivotal maintenance, because elms will continue to push from a singular junction, an internode, the base of a branch, or an area in the finer ramification as we get those structural flaws pruned out of the tree over the course of time from those fine tertiary areas developing 3 and 4 branches coming out of a singular area. And every time we come back and prune, we'll see pieces that are woody that we've been developing and developing ramification on and be like, why didn't I prune this earlier? How could this have escaped me? You know, maybe we needed the density, maybe the other branch wasn't as refined, maybe we had to do it rather quickly one time and we missed that. Any number of reasons, but every time that we're pruning for refinement, we're thinking, okay, I'm going to reduce the elongated, stronger pieces to transition strength from the tip to the interior, which is what incites another flush, which is what stimulates from 1 branch to 2 branch. That is the development of ramification, pruning back the elongated pieces. But then we've got to be checking, hey, listen, dead twigs, dead stubs, unsightly branches. In the broadleaf model, branches that have grown outside of the silhouette, we're not looking to wire every single fine branch on this tree. In fact, we will come back and we will wire this tree, but we're going to be strategically wiring the branches that need it to generate and develop the overall form. A good case in point here is you see this space is a little bit clogged. When I go like this, now I have a defined negative space. Okay, I'm not going to wire every branch on this actual physical structural piece, but I am going to bring that down and that clarifies this space. And if you start to look at, oh, if I bring this here and then I bring this here, suddenly 2 wires to adjust this, 1 wire to adjust this, and we've reconciled this entire area. That is the mode of action for broadleaf. Okay, so we're pruning back that tip, inciting a second flush from 1 to 2. We're taking off dead stubs, branches, and pieces that have grown out of the actual existing mass that's going to be present in that branch. And again, these are finer pieces, and then we're correcting those structural flaws. Where we have 3s and 4s, taking those down to 2s. That compilation of things that we're considering in the pruning process really allows us to maximize the quality of our broadleaf deciduous trees. And in the case of an elm, it's imperative because they do swell, they are aggressive, they are resource generators to a very significant degree. If we don't correct those things, if we're not eliminating those dead twigs, we start to get a lack of airflow and circulation, we get a lack of light penetration because of dead pieces, because of dead stubs, because we didn't highly manicure that piece. This is a part of high-level, small broadleaf, small leaf, broadleaf deciduous trees that we've got to really embrace and take on this annual application of routine maintenance and continued refinement. Okay? I'm going to continue moving through the structure of this tree. I now have a very firm idea of what a strong area looks like in terms of density, and I recognize very quickly that my weaker areas are going to need a slight degree of pruning, but I now have a reference and a sample to base how much I'm going to reduce those with. Once we've done the entire pruning, I'm gonna come back and we're gonna strategically wire these pieces to position those few outliers that can really be pulled in to generate and define negative space, positive space, but really trying to embrace what this tree has evolved into, which is a soft, natural aesthetic independent of wire control and the tightness that we see in the coniferous model. Broadleaf trees need to be billowy, need to be informal, and that naturalization of the branching is something we have to learn to embrace, freeing ourselves of that tight constricted nature. I love the transition that's happened to this area, and I'm going to continue to carry this through the rest of the stronger areas. We will zoom back in when we hit a weaker area that we can then balance, but let me get through some of the stronger areas of the tree first. Hopefully that's shed some light on summer Chinese elm pruning from the perspective of how we take these elongated shoots. Now here's the thing. Okay, conversations happening in the chat. Is this a Nire Keiki? Is this a dwarf variety of some sort? Okay, this is Yatsubusa, Pinus parviflora, Yatsubusa, right? And is it a sport of cork bark? Is it a sport of Hokkaido? I don't know. I honestly don't know the origins of Yatsubusa. Yatsubusa was a term in Japan used to describe a genetic mutation, right? So any cultivar that is outside of the pure strain genetics is a Yatsubusa cultivar, which is interesting when we bring it to North America and suddenly it's another catch term, right? Like Seiju is a catch term, like cork bark is a catch term. Yatsubusa became a catch term that somebody coined as a variety, right? Patented it, boom, boom, boom. Now we can sell it in the nursery industry. And interestingly enough, the company that patented that name was the place where Randy and I went and dug this mother stock back in 2010. They were the single sole propagator of Yatsubusa Chinese Elm in all of North America. And they just happened to be one of the biggest propagation nurseries in the country, right? 82 years. We dug it. It's now 94 years that this tree has been in existence and being handled. Not to this degree of refinement, though. And the interesting thing, too, is when you see the initial images of this tree as it started, this big, massive thing, and then suddenly we air layer off a majority of the components to shrink down the size of it, right? And then we start wiring it and pruning it and handling it in a developmental way. And then we start moving into the secondary methodology, and then we start handling it on a tertiary methodology. It's like the process is all here, and now we're at refinement. Now several of us have Chinese elms in refinement, and we say, okay, pruning those leaves back to 2, the stronger areas of the tree, I see how it reduces. Let me give you a once around because I have left some of the weaker areas untouched in terms of unpruned with a higher degree of density. And this is really where wiring comes into the pruning process on broadleaf deciduous. Now, if I had a large leaf variety of deciduous right now, I'm not going to be performing wiring work in the middle of summer. The fact that this is a smaller leaf variety, the fact that if we have a refined Chinese elm, if we have a refined smaller leaf, that we can come back and we can utilize this period of time in the year to really shape up the structure, to start to dial in, open it up, spread it out. And this is how we empower some of the weaker areas through the combination of pruning plus wire, right? Now there's another thing that we touched on, which we said, hey, listen, I want to be handling this tree's structure at this point in time from a wiring perspective because I'm preparing for exhibition after the leaves have dropped in the fall, right? Now, typically with exhibition, I want to take all the wire off. But I'm saying, listen, in terms of a tree of this scale, I understand that there is going to have to be some wire on this tree when it goes into exhibition. And the most beautiful thing about proactively planning in terms of deciduous broadleaf structural work or deciduous broadleaf wire work for exhibition is if we handle it now, and we're dealing with a rough bark variety like an elm, and in particular a dark rough bark variety like an elm, copper wire will oxidize between now and that exhibition. And you will see over the course of time, if you come to the Pacific Bonsai Expo, how much that wire blends in the areas that we leave it intact, okay? So as we go through this, I don't want to, and let's just establish, and I think we've done this once before, exhibition wiring on the spruce, on the Jonathan Cross slab. We said, listen, the goal is not to tighten this thing up. The goal is not to wire this thing out. The goal is to be adjusting bigger blocks of foliage. This is refinement wiring of broadleaf deciduous, and that fundamental wiring of broadleaf deciduous also becomes show wiring of broadleaf deciduous, because at this point, with this level of refinement over the past 12 years, I'm not trying to wire my secondary, tertiary pieces out. Okay, I'm not trying to tighten up this pad so that it's a single coniferous layer, right? I like that naturalness to it. But what I am saying is when I look at the front of the tree, I want to get this out into sunlight here. I want to make that move, okay? That's a big move. That's a big branch. That branch is the size of my thumb. And notice that I've left some of the weaker pads in here unpruned. I've sort of held back on this piece. I need to move this out so that I can start to actually adjust. It's from this point that I want to start to dive in to the actual structural wiring and show wiring for this particular piece and show you how to handle a mature elm specifically, but an elm that's also going to show an elm that's also nearing a really wonderful stage where we're no longer wiring the entire thing. We're picking our moments to show the tree, show the space, show the positive and negative so that we really see this tree in all of its splendor, okay? Now I'm going to open it up to questions, but let me just walk you through this very first piece, because when we start to talk about wiring on a tree with bark of this level, the last thing that I'm going to do is put wire anywhere on the trunk of this tree. That would be an absolute nightmare. It would be sacrilegious to do so. It would destroy the tree. And some of you might be saying, well, what about guy wires? Okay, well, guy wires are not going to hold the shape once I get to exhibition, right? I'm not going to leave guy wires on an exhibition. I would love to have all the wires off of this tree, but I don't think that's going to maximize the aesthetic of the tree. So I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to say, all right, I'm going to go ahead and plan on the dynamics of my wire giving me the capacity through appropriate assessment of contact points, okay? Appropriate assessment of contact points. So if you just come in here tight, okay, I have a point here. I want to move this piece in this direction, which means it wants to rebound in this direction. So I have to have my wire contacting the trunk right here. And if I move there and it wants to push back into this wire, that wire is holding that position. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to utilize my offhand. Now this is where it gets really tricky. Show wiring, we talk about this a number of times. If you're able to get a tree to the point where you're going to be exhibition wiring the tree, you should be able to. You should have confidence that you have the technical capacity to be doing this kind of work, okay? And understanding wire dynamics. This is an evolved skill set in the bonsai practice to say, I understand that if I want to move a branch to the left, I have to approach that branch from the right, okay? This is fundamental to the practice of bonsai. If I want to move the branch down, I have to approach the branch from the top, because if I want to move it down, it's going to want to rebound back up. If I want to move it to the left, it's going to want to rebound back right, okay? So I'm going to shift my fingers. Watch how I start to work this, because my offhand has got to be absolutely deadly in terms of its accuracy of application of pressure to get clean, accurate. This is 6-gauge copper wire that I'm applying right here, okay? So I've got to have everything pretty darn dialed in to have this get the kind of contact that starts to give me function, okay? Now watch closely, because if I can avoid carrying this all the way up the trunk, and I'm just trying to see here, I've got a little piece of bark that it's kind of flaking off. I'll re-glue that there and show you guys how to do that. Okay, if I'm going to go ahead and move this with as minimal amount of wire, I'm going to hold right here with my pliers. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to bend, and now watch. When I release, that pressure right there, That tiny little piece is what allowed me to shift that out of that central area. Now let me show you here, okay, where we got the space that exists here, okay? So I started it, I held it, I got good application on that piece. I grabbed it with my pliers, secured it to the trunk, I moved the branch away. Now watch this technique. Come in close for me, Josh. Okay, right underneath here. As I bend to the left here, I flex down with my plier there and tighten right over that shoulder, and it holds that bend, okay? This is wire dynamics. Do I want to wire all the way up this? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I have no reason to be wiring up it. In fact, 2 or 3 turns to give me the ability to move on the base. Let me cut it at a discrete location. I'm being very, very careful of the bark as well as the branching. Okay, that's all I'm looking for. That's the extent of that move right there. Now watch what this empowers me to do. Watch what this empowers me to do, because now we're going to come back to the pruning process. I have an area here, a little bit has been historically hidden underneath this piece right here. I don't want to shift this piece right here. I love what's happening in this area. So I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to start to leave a little bit of a longer, some of these unpruned on the interior. Exterior, I don't want it to be any longer. Pieces hanging down, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take off. But I am just going ahead and pruning to the desired density of the area so that I have that homogeneous density across the entirety of this lower piece, right? These upper pieces that are starting to bump into this pad above it, I want to go ahead and I want to reduce their height. So now I'm starting to prune via aesthetics. This is no longer pruning back to 2 to get bifurcation on an elm, because this is an area that has a significant amount of weakness in terms of it's been underneath another branch. Doesn't mean that it can't exist here. The traditional model of bonsai is all about balancing that energy so that you keep those interior pieces that show that sense of scale while still having the capacity to have that length, to have that perspective, that proportion, etc. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to work on this. I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm assuming there's a lot from the prior clip as well as where we're evolving to in the lesson. But as we're answering questions, I'm just going to be homogenizing this density so that this area that we're looking at has the same quality and the same effect as the areas around it by the time we're done.
Yeah, first up, Kim was asking about the Pacific Bonsai exhibition and said, question for Ryan, did you rescue yourself from judging your own trees at the expo? And I think you were actually one of the jurors with Bill Valvenis and Bjorn Bjorholm, right?
Yeah, so I was a juror. I am not a judge. I don't know how the judging takes place. I don't have a tremendous amount of clarity on the Pacific Bonsai Expo. They asked me to be a juror, so I was only involved in the selection process. And similar to the Artisans Cup, you know, Michael Hagedorn and I were the jurors for the Artisans Cup that selected the trees that were at the exhibition, but we were not the judges of the Artisans Cup. And I think as an organizer, I commend Eric and Jonas for finding, you know, both jurors and judges independent of the organization of it, because it does tend to create potentially some conflict of interest. I think it's best to take yourself out of it. And I was, you know, obviously proud to be a juror of the exhibition. I think it's going to be a very high quality exhibition from the state of the trees that I was assessing. There's some really, really beautiful, California dominant to be sure, but some beautiful trees that are going to be on display, and I think they're going to be in top-notch form for such a special venue.
Bob asks, is this applicable for all varieties of Chinese elm?
All varieties of Chinese elm. This is a perfect time. So we've gone through all of the, and let's just kind of talk about how we handle Chinese elm. If you're in a warmer weather area of North America, you probably have already had to prune or probably have already chosen to prune Chinese elm. Where we're at farther north, we wait a little bit longer for them to harden off and regain energy. This tree, you know, there's probably 3,000 branch tips on this tree. You can see the container, again, a Byron Myrick container from long ago, customized for this tree by Byron. And the size of the container for a size of this tree is proportionally appropriate, right? But beyond being proportionally appropriate, we have to understand that if I put this in too small of a container as a broadleaf deciduous, high water mobility, sheen-based in terms of an elm as the behavior, okay, I would never have the capacity to sustain life in this many branch tips, right? We feed this aggressively as a broadleaf deciduous tree in refinement. We try to get it to grow. And if we were seeing excessively strong areas growing and taking some of the strength early on, we probably would have checked those pieces of growth to direct into the interior. But ultimately, when you're maintaining highly, highly refined broadleaf deciduous trees with a tremendous amount of ramification, we build up that energy, we let it reaccumulate. Japanese maple, higher water mobility, less heat tolerant. We get to that point where we need to manage and balance that strength before the interior branches lose that vigor and we get that discrepancy and we start to see shedding. We have to do that early on. But we talk about elm. This was out in 117 degrees last summer. I did not protect this tree. It was full sun, start to finish, 117, and it did not blink. Very, very durable, tolerant, tropically capable of tolerance, right? When we start to talk about elm as a semi-deciduous, semi-evergreen species in the Southern California region, warmer areas of North America, Europe, Asia, etc., I felt very confident. It did not disappoint, but I have to work very hard here in a cooler climate to get that energy built back up. You might need to touch an elm like this a little bit sooner for the refinement pruning, but just keep this in mind. This is not producing at this point of refinement the kind of elongated growth that's going to blow out a branch tip, cause a distortion of thickening in a singular area, suck the energy out of a branch by a water sprout pushing. That's not where we're at least not with the dwarf or a genetic mutation that is the Yatsubusa, the Seijus, the cork barks, etc., right? We're not going to see that kind of behavior happen, and on a really refined Chinese elm, I would not assume we would see that behavior either because the energy is distributed. We need to let that leaf mass regain that energy. We need to leave as little amount of time after the pruning process for them to produce just a small flush of foliar load after this, recover, small amount of bifurcated twigging, harden off right around that middle to end of August period of time, and then they move into vascular productivity. That is how you refine Chinese elm that has a tremendous amount of ramification. Now, you have to build to that. Because if I were in development or I was in secondary, we already handled our developmental elms. We already pruned, we already stopped elongation when developmental goals were accomplished, when healing was accomplished. We did that about a month ago. We handled secondary elms 2-3 weeks ago, where we went through, we selected secondary branches that we were going to continue to elongate. Ones that were too strong, we pruned back to get bifurcation, transition energy to other areas to grow on for the rest of the foliar growth period, right? That happens earlier so that because we have fewer tips, we have fewer distribution of energy, and we need to start pushing energy in desirable locations. For this, I want to homogenize the energy. How do I homogenize the energy? Well, we prune and partially defoliate on a Japanese maple. Sometimes we cut the fingers off of the leaf in the strongest areas. We're evening out the foliar distribution, and this is what I'm talking about when I say, listen, stronger areas, come back to 2. You have to be diligent in an area like this where there's density, where there's strength, where this is going to accumulate. Each one of these pieces is going to have 7, 8, 10 internodes by the time we prune. But then we start to look on the interior here. And as opposed to all of those having 7, 8, 10 internodes of elongation, 1 in every 4, 5, 6 of these shoots is elongating, and I'm saying, oh, 1 in every 4, 5, 6 of these shoots is elongating. I've got roughly 30% less ramification. It means I can't cut back to 2. I can't cut back to 2 on those elongating pieces. I have got to leave more leaf mass if 30% fewer branch tips that have elongated by a significantly lesser degree are going to equal the same foliar load. Right? And that becomes the gist of it. The wiring to position and then the pruning to be able to adapt, balance, and sort of redefine that distribution, which will impact the tree physiologically as well as aesthetically.
Paul asked, are you trying to take 3s and 4s down to 2 at this time, or do you wait until leaf drop in the fall? I think you were just kind of touching on some of that.
Okay, 3s and 4s down to 2s has to happen at this time because vascular productivity is going to begin to occur very, very soon, right? We start to move into vascular productivity. Again, put this on your calendar just as a reminder for you, and if once the app is out, you won't have to do that. But August 15th is the change of behavior as this is a broad brush stroke, right? Obviously, there's nuances to this, where you live, how trees are behaving, etc. But in general, daylight length northern hemisphere, August 15th is when everything changes, okay? And we start to see that. What other species do we deal with in August 15th? Japanese black pine. That's when we can cut developmental shoots back to the desired length and they amass buds there instead of pushing a second flush. That's when you see the foliar to vascular shift, and that is an important period because most of our species change behavior. Fertilization needs to shift behavior at that point in time based on what the plants are starting to do to accumulate vascular resources. And I'm not saying fertilize at that point. Typically we don't fertilize in August, but if you were going to fertilize, you're going to be shifting your fertilizer approach at that point in time. Okay, so we need to be taking that down. Now, I've looked at that across this tree, but bear in mind that this tree has been refinement pruned for, I'm going to say development probably lasted until 2015. In 2015, Troy went through this thing and we really cleaned out 3s and 4s aggressively and started to super refine and dial in the ramification. And we still have periodic flare-ups where we'll get 3s or 4s. There's so many branch tips in here that we miss them. Sometimes they become congested. Sometimes certain branch tips are missed in the pruning process over the course of time by yours truly or somebody else who would be handling this tree. And we would say, ooh, I need to adjust that, right? I need to come back in. We're looking for those. I'm looking at all of the ramification, dead twigs, weak areas, all of those things, because it happens a lot when we start to get this kind of density occurring inside of this canopy. We're looking to change and adjust all of that at this point in time. There will be one time with Chinese elm where you're just going to have to bite the bullet and go in with detailed spectacles, magnifying glass, whatever you got, to be able to see the fine little areas inside of that and be able to make the kind of pruning decisions that really fortify and define that ramification, okay? And that is a singular kind of action that you take when this tree's built up, dense, developmental pieces are almost accomplished, secondaries have been wired out, styled, and you're trying to refine independent pads and start to create that tertiary branching. That's really when you focus on cutting those 3s and 4s down to really sustainable 2s and beginning the high level of ramification. And there was a year where all of our Yatsubusas kind of got to that point at one singular moment in time, and Troy really did a bang-up job of setting them on the path of success. And they've just built since then. That was a defining moment of transition for these trees.
Chuck asks, and says first, I guess, that thick vertical branch on the left really catches the eye, almost like an iterative trunk. I wonder if the tree would look better without it. On the other hand, it gives the tree a very unique and very aged character. What does everyone think? This is for the chat. Then he followed up later and said, Ira, please ask Ryan about that thick branch. I'm guessing Ryan will say without it, it's just another 90-year-old magnificent Yatsubusa elm.
Iconic. Iconic. I think it's iconic. You know, because here's the thing. Sergio Kwan has an interpretation of the Yatsubusa elm. His big Yatsubusa elm came from Mirai. It was part of the same stock. In fact, Sergio's was my favorite, and he reached out and said, hey, I'm looking for a really good one. And we threw that out there. And then I kind of started looking at this one, and I started kind of playing on, and let me just show you this from the back because it's not nearly as straight from the back. It actually has quite a bit of character and movement and bifurcation that occurs inside of that big structure. I mean, this has nice curve, there's wonderful, beautiful branching, etc. But if you take this out, the major depth piece, and when we talk about elm, elm is this up and out, lower branches are shorter, upper canopy expands. That's what makes this feel like an actual proportional to scale giant elm in my mind. And if you've ever spent time around an old elm, they start out with big branches down low, the upper canopy develops, the lower branches are shed, the upper canopy expands, light gets back to the bottom, and that's why they have those shorter branches down low. That piece feels like it's what makes this identifiably old, special, and unique. Does it catch your eye? Yes. Is that of detriment? Some people are going to say I would cut that off. I think if you cut that off, and here's why I would never do it, it's not necessarily that the loss of that line wouldn't improve the tree, but what you would have in its place is a slingshot right here. You would have a really wide crotch right there that suddenly would be an open window, and you would stare at it and you'd say, gosh, I wish I could have that branch back. I royally screwed this tree up. I royally screwed it up. And then you say, now I got to cut this off. And you cut this off, and then you just have a dead straight slanting trunk, and you're like, holy cow, One problem led to another, and I want to take it all back. I wish I had never done that. I'm never going to fix it. It's never going to be the same. And you'd be correct. You would have officially destroyed this tree, right? Be very, very careful with those sort of automated responses, okay? Let me walk you through some other things that I'm kind of seeing here, okay? I've got a little bit of a weaker area in here, and one of the things that makes broadleaf deciduous so incredibly special is the large number of sites where primary or secondary branches originate. Now this is a secondary branch coming off of a sub-trunk branch, trunk branch. I don't know what this is. This feels to me like a trunk slash branch slash trunk. Do we have to define it? No, in natural looking trees, nobody's sitting there going, is that a branch or a trunk? It's like this is a freaking tree, you know? That's what it is. Okay, but I've got this piece here that's sitting and it feels very important. Go ahead and bring me in tight there. It's very weak. It's not very sustainable. And this is one of those moments where I rarely want to be taking these small interior pieces off because they give me a tremendous sense of scale. Now let me go ahead while we're on the wide and put that back. Okay, you see this in here, moving, and I take, look at this space that created. Okay, this is very important. Now this is where we get into broadleaf deciduous wiring on a refinement level, okay? Because again, I'm not wiring everything out. I'm not handling all the tips. We've worked hard to get to this point. This is the fruits of our labor. Okay, if I'm to this point and I need to move one of these here, or I need to move both of these here, that's the wiring scope. I just needed to move this trunk out. Took me 3 wraps, perfectly located on the trunk in terms of application. Technique was stellar. Boom, held its place, I'm done, okay? Here's the question. Do you want to fill that space? Okay, watch this. Do you want to fill that space? Because I can fill that space. And I can change that distribution of space. Or I can leave that up and I can leave that open, okay? I also have this piece back here. Do we want to elevate this? This creates interest here. Notice how that bleeds into this, and then I go here, there, right? You see that? That's interesting. Now watch closely. If I go up here and I come down here, I completely close that space and it changes that relationship yet again. This is the crux of deciduous wiring on a refinement level, making educated, informed, nuanced decisions about the canopy. It's not, I'm going to wire all the branches down. They all went up. Now I'm going to wire them down. No, you're destroying all of your work. It's, man, how do I change positive and negative space for the betterment of definition of those two values in design to maximize the appearance of age? How do I remove specific, minimal in the broadleaf deciduous? Okay, this is not a coniferous, more negative space, greater degree of asymmetry. That's not where this tree is, and we don't want to take it there. Otherwise, we'd cut that straight trunk off and start the downward demise, okay? We're saying, listen, let's elevate this as the grandest statement of a broadleaf deciduous. Okay, when I look at this, and let me just give you my informed opinion, okay, this feels like a very heavy block of undefined foliar mass at the bottom of the tree. Elevating that branch starts to lighten it. Dropping that branch further provides definition and space inside of that. I like that combination. That is what I'm going to go about doing, okay? Now here's the problem. This piece on the interior here, this is not a skinny piece. Go ahead and bring me in tight there on Lonnie's camera. Okay, this is not a skinny piece, and again, I would never ever wire over the shoulder of this into that bark. So that means that I've got to go ahead and just like I did on this lowest trunk, I've got to provide that pointed application of wire that when I bend down and that branch wants to hinge back into that trunk, there's a wire there supporting that downward movement so that I'm able to actually hold that position. Okay, I'm going to move into an 8 gauge here because I am kind of going on a downward trajectory with a relatively stout branch. Once we position this piece, then we'll move to that rear piece and get definition. Just sort of understanding that when we provide wire from this kind of wiring technique and capacity, we have a very minimal number of times that we can actually move that branch before that wire no longer functions. We have got to be on point. Again, if you are capable of refining a tree to this degree, you should be capable of going this next step with your technical application. Go ahead and let her rip, Ira.
Shoebird Steve asks, can this pruning strategy cut back to the first 2 leaves with viable buds in their axils be used on Zelkova?
Zelkova is a larger leaf, and from a larger leaf variety to get the sugar starch suppression right? When we talk dwarf varieties, we've got small leaves. If I tried to come in here and have every one of these leaves that I left behind, it's hard enough just to prune back to the first 2 active buds. Okay, if I tried to have every one of these leaves, I would visually not be able to stay in the work long enough to do it. It would be so microscopic, and it would be so not necessary and counterproductive, okay? But when you talk about larger leaf varieties and you get into a Zelkova, which typically does produce a larger leaf, that is where the sugar starch suppression of reducing the leaf surface area of each independent leaf becomes very, very necessary. Not only functional, but necessary. Also applicable, capable. You're capable of doing that kind of work, okay? So that's the difference of the small leaf, broadleaf, deciduous varieties versus the large leaf, broadleaf, deciduous varieties, is the partial defoliation of those pieces changes its nuance based on that leaf size, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to hold right here. Let me get my pliers because that gives me a little bit more dexterity. And I'm just going to rotate slightly, okay, just to get that down. I have a little bit of give me. Now, I don't want to wire out to the tip. Again, I don't want to wire out to the tip. Because if I wire out to the tip, I'm going to change that upward line. This upward line is what works with this upward line is what works with this upward line. We have that theme set. So if I take that curved upward line and I flatten that out, it's going to stand out like a sore thumb. Okay? Now you see this dropped into this area. Now what do we do on a weaker interior branch that we've come back and we've wired? We come back in and we prune. We adjust that length. We adjust that to have that same density. We want to keep those interior runners from getting too long. We've created a sustainable position for this piece to exist, and now we can go ahead and balance its density and improve its aesthetic. Once we're done with this, we'll move on to the next one in the back, but I'll keep answering questions while I'm getting this done.
Bentley has a question. He says, is mid-July the timing for elm, or are we just running a little bit late here in the Pacific Northwest? And I know you kind of touched on this, and he'd asked the chat as well, but if you could kind of clarify our timing.
Mid-July, even in Japan, when we were handling elm in a refinement capacity right around this time. And Mr. Kimura would wait for this time, and then we would bring all of them in at once, and we would go through this process of just really delicate refinement pruning. And some people say, well, I thought Mr. Kimura didn't necessarily do broadleaf deciduous. He did broadleaf deciduous to the degree that he needed them, right? And the biggest area where we used broadleaf deciduous at Mr. Kimura's was for shohin and chuhin sized trees for kokufu 3-point displays. Right, and so that's where we were having to maintain. And if you have to maintain, 20, 30, 40 kokufu level shohin, nirekeiyaki, or pure strain Chinese elm, any of these varieties that have the smaller leaf and this characteristic that we're speaking to, you have got to be very, very quick and adept at handling them. Otherwise, they will absolutely eat you alive. They'll chew up your entire scope of work and timing at that point in the summer where there's a lot of other trees, coniferous-wise, that need your attention. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to reduce a little bit of the height here just so that we can start to kind of see the proportion once we move this into that space. I know I said wire first, but this one is already going to be a little bit big, so let me just shrink it down. Okay, that's how we kind of balanced and managed that. Japan is hot. It's humid. It's like the southeastern United States. Maybe a little bit stickier and hotter. And so from that perspective, unless you have completely through fertilization or size of container blown out a Chinese elm in refinement and have big, strong, long shoots that are overly thickening it, and you need to prune it, if you have a tree that's produced this much mass in the appropriately sized container and you're appropriately fertilizing it, which again, they should take a fairly copious quantity of fertilizer to be able to maintain such a significant leaf mass, then you should not have an issue coming back at this point in time and doing this work. This should be a fairly universal timing mechanism. Okay, so when I'm looking at this, let's just go ahead and kind of touch on this. And again, I may need to adjust the branch that I positioned slightly earlier. Okay, I'm going to elevate this branch right here. Now, when I look, if I try to wire this branch to this piece right here, it's going to cause this whole thing to droop, right? Because this is This is already quite a bit of weight on a relatively slender piece. You just see how kind of flimsy this is back in here, right? So I need to be thinking about the fact that this is a structural wire that's going to hold the position of this piece and allow me to elevate that piece into that space. I also want to be thinking, do I want to be shifting anything here? Now when I look here, this is extending fairly far towards the back. I would not mind decreasing that width by just shifting that in, having those smaller areas, gaining a little density and unification of pads. So I'm going to utilize one 8-gauge wire to run tip to tip. Now this makes my combination and the execution of my wiring far more effortless because now it's going to be an anchored piece of wire. But I have to work through all of the finer branches, which when we wire broadleaf deciduous trees in leaf, okay, and I don't advise this on larger leaf varieties. Again, this is very special for refinement trees that we're handling at a point in time where we're really trying to increase design sustainability. We're pruning to reset the system and balance the foliar mass and potentially preparing for a show that'll happen when the tree drops its leaves. This is that moment where we can get away with this. If I wired it in the spring, it would already be biting in. I'd have to take it off and do this again anyways. So it just makes sense, right? Okay, but we have to be working around those branches.
Sally asks, we have an extended period of hot weather here. She's in San Antonio, Texas, and her cedar elms are going dormant. Can she trim the elongated pieces in the manner you described, or is it too late?
Yeah, that's a good question. What does that kind of heat on cedar elm? Because I'm saying this works on Chinese elm, but cedar elm is a little bit of a different behavior, native to that really hot, humid region. I would say that I would probably err on the side of caution as opposed to going ahead and trying to perform this kind of work. I don't know, and I feel like cedar elm is one of these, like a winged elm, that I've always wanted to really dig deep with and experiment. I almost acquired a cedar elm that had a fairly significant degree of refinement that I was going to carry forward. It didn't work out. That's okay. But I really would like to be able to answer that question for you. Currently, I would say if it's going dormant, right, you don't want to be heavily pruning and changing the tree's behavior. That typically tends to be a bad time tree trying to say, listen, I'm going dormant because it's either too cold or too hot. Obviously for you, it's too hot right now. Not the time to be reducing its transpirational capacity, not the time to really be doing big, heavy work and asking the tree to respond.
Kim asks, is this tree as brittle to wire as Seiju?
No, not even remotely close. In fact, both corkbark and Yatsubusa elm are fairly forgiving in terms of wire. Now watch how, and when I say deliberate application, notice how slow I'm putting the wire on. I'm not crashing through these branches, right? My hands are approaching the branches from the bottom. They're supporting the interior branching. I'm being very, very careful to not apply any pressure or catch those finer branches with that structural wire. This is the kind of work where you say, listen, I'm not wiring, I don't have to be fast at this. You don't have to be fast at this. Quite the opposite. Go slow when we're working on these things. Go slow, be incredibly deliberate, make sure your supporting hand is in the right location, make sure that you're completely clear of all the foliar mass. This is not about speed because I'm not wiring this whole tree. This isn't going to take you a tremendous amount of time because I'm going to put maybe 10, 12, 15 pieces of wire on this whole tree, and then I'm going to be done. That's refinement wiring of a broadleaf deciduous. And this is where if you put the time in the initial structural setting, and you put the time in when you come back and you do that secondary scaffolding to create the pads. And what does that mean when we say secondary scaffolding to create the pads? If we come in close here, this is a secondary pad, this is a secondary pad. This is a secondary pad, that's a secondary pad, that's a secondary pad. By dividing these into these different areas, I create a sense of scale. If I unify all of these, that's a giant pad and my tree suddenly looks small. But when I break those up and those are different foliar masses, now you start to get the impression of that bigger tree. That is how we create scale in bonsai design, is through secondary division of branching into pads. Not tertiary, right? Secondary. This is my structural branch. These are the branches coming off structural. Those are secondary. That is how I create that sense of scale, okay? So by doing so, that helps me start to build all of this. Now, if you do the structural correctly, you then come back in, you take that growth on secondary, you manage it, you select, you avoid structural flaws, you start to lay out, create, divide, give that sense of scale. After that point, that's when we start pruning, partially defoliating. In the case of a smaller leaf Chinese elm, we're just pruning at this point in time. It's going to give me another little short spurt of growth because we've waited until the midsummer. We have a limited time until foliar growth really cuts off. Awesome time to get a nice fine flush of ramification, okay? And then we're into fall vascular productivity. Excellent, we timed it perfectly, okay? But this is that moment where we start to build those twigs. Now, your first response to that pruning is not gonna be super short, tight branching. Don't be that person that says, man, I wanted refinement, I pruned my tree that just came out of secondary and it's not giving me short twigs. What did I do wrong? Well, you have to distribute. The short twigs that we're earning on this tree are from distributing across the multitude of finer branching over several years. You have to earn that. That's an earned fineness because we're distributing the energy in the container across an increasing amount of fine ramification, and consequently we get to a point where it is so fine that it's absolutely dialed in. Okay, so here we go. Now we're looking at the wide shot. Let me go ahead and just join you here for a second because I want to look at this too. Okay, there's more clarity there already. Now you see right in here, that's where that back piece is lifting up. You see right here, that's where that piece is dropping down. I like this definition of space. I like seeing this front piece roll into that branch tip, okay? Where we had it originally, this piece was down here, homogeneous to that, okay? And see how much bigger that makes that feel? Just that small little shift, and we can go up a little bit more. Let me see. Let me go up to the back. Just come down a little bit. Okay, that changes it even a little bit more. Now, I can shorten this. I can start to reduce this. If I reduce this, do I get to the same length as this? I want to be very, very careful. There's a 3/4 cam. Let me go ahead and blast you in. Come back to the 3/4 cam for me, Josh. Okay, if I reduce this, it starts to blend in with this. So notice this is pointed, notice this is rounded. Okay, I don't want pointed. Pointed is young, rounded is older on a broadleaf deciduous. I'm just gonna go ahead and reduce that so I have that nice roll in, and then boop, right there. And then we've got this. Now let's just take a look at this. Do I wanna drop down a little bit more? Okay, I don't wanna close that space. I don't wanna close that space. That feels like we're gonna now have boom, boom, boom. See how we even out that spacing and cadence between the three? Having that offset so that that spacing is bigger, and then we go boom, boom. Real quick, that's the move. That's the move right there. That space right there, oh, that's lovely, okay? So I'm just gonna do a little bit of pruning. We set, we look, we toil, we think, we wrestle, we tinker, we cut a little bit here, we cut a little bit there. This is a fairly sparse area. I don't want to be cutting back to 2s. I'm just kind of cutting to have the density while controlling length. Yes, that feels quite nice. There's really not much there. I've got a little bit of elongation here, and we keep moving. Okay, I'm going to work on the back side here because this is a little bit more vigorous. Now, I like this pushed in. I like this pushed in a lot. Okay, this was all the way out here. Let me just show you where it was. Boom. Okay, we're going to push that in here. I'm just going to swing that back, okay? Careful here, I don't want to break, but there was a question about how forgiving these are. These are incredibly flexible comparatively. They still will break. They're still an elm. Don't forget, they're still an elm.
ED asks if you've considered a new pot for the next repot, and Bentley had a similar question. Can we discuss the reasons why this pot pairs so well with this tree?
Primarily size. I think size is appropriate, and this tree has lived in this pot for a fairly significant period of time. Again, in fact, if you look at Sergio's elm, you'll see it's in an identical pot. It's just a slightly different size because we needed 2 pots to try and find the right one. This was the right one for this one. That was the right one for that one. It worked out marvelously. I also feel like the color is an interesting and beautiful complement because we've got this green. Now, what would you say would work well with the green in terms of a container pairing, especially when you get into that winter silhouette? You know, when we talk about, okay, green, we could kind of talk about We could talk about red. Well, there is a red in here. The unglazed portion is that orangey red. I think that works well. We can talk about blue from the deciduous model, especially a deeper value of blue, highlighting maybe a little bit stronger character, thicker trunk, more massive appearance. We have a relatively deep gray blue kind of value here. And then you could say, well, yeah, I mean, but also you could kind of be in that opposite of green, kind of like an orangey cream. And so you kind of have all three here that play nicely on the color from my perspective. Could this be a more traditional form of container? Yes. What would that traditional form be? A more rigid rectangle with a cut corner or an inset corner. Could be very, very beautiful. You could have a slight angle to the wall, but you would need a little bit narrower foot to get to the same width, and then you would see it was undersized, so then you have the same width and it angles out and it's oversized. It's a tough mark to hit to find something to compensate with the right size physiologically and all of the aesthetic elements that would contribute to it actually working. I don't think you're gonna find that. I just simply don't think you're gonna find it. I think you can look. I'll always keep my eye out on every tree that I own at Mirai for a better pot. There's almost always a better pot. Occasionally you hit that perfect marriage. Okay, I don't think you're gonna find anywhere. I don't think you're gonna find anywhere outside of a random occurrence walking across something because serendipity dropped on your face, a pot that's gonna complement this tree better than the current piece.
Ricky D had another question. He said, could this tree accept root grafts, or would that be a very difficult venture?
Very tough, very tough. Okay, and here's why. It's not to say that elm can't accept root grafts, because elm can accept root grafts, but this is a Yatsubusa elm. And if I cut one of these branches off and I dug into the cross section of what makes the bark that sort of almost burrow-like formation pattern, it is a very, very odd and irregular vascular creation and vascular structure that exists in there. From that perspective, trying to enter that irregularity of that vascular structure is incredibly challenging. And I think from that perspective, it would be a big ask to try and root graft. Okay, now let me pull your attention down here into this lower area. Okay, this is another one of these sort of undefined areas, and I'm not trying to round them off necessarily. I like this sort of elevation that I'm getting on these branches here. I like what's happening down inside. But notice this piece just kind of sticking up as a young little vigorous piece. Now watch what happens. Boom. See that? Boom. Just a small little detail, okay? But leaving a branch just sticking up like this and being lazy about it, that's not the move. That's not a show wiring. That's not an exhibition quality piece of work. We want to go ahead and we want to focus on those fine details as well as the larger image. I'm going to shift from that big wire back to a 14 gauge over here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come in here from this structural wire. I'm just going to give myself a half turn on the other branch right at a nice junction. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to drop that down. Okay, this is by far getting into tertiary levels of wiring. I want to avoid this at all costs if I can, but I will not avoid it at the cost or expenditure of the tree's quality, especially if I'm preparing for show.
Danny asks, how many times has this tree been repotted since collection?
That's a good question. How many times has this been repotted? Once into this container and once to clean out the sheen. So, you know, since collection, twice. It was put into a box with pumice. Okay, there's that nice cleanup of that area. It was put into a box with pumice, and then from the box with pumice, it was put into this container with still the native field soil from the Propagation nursery, which was, you know, some of that really beautiful, dense Oregon clay. Not your most ideal soil medium. So we had to go back in and clean that out because it was starting to cause some issues with the health. Again, elm is a sheen-based variety of deciduous, so we understand that that sheen has got to be highly managed and manicured in terms of being able to create health over the course of time. One of the things that I have had to with clients' collections over the course of time. In particular, the two species most notably impacted by a poor sheen, hornbeam and elm. Going back in and fixing the sheen of a hornbeam or an elm is absolutely frightening when a tree has already started to lose its vigor. Okay, because that's when you're going to see heavy, heavy branch shedding. That's when you're going to see, no matter who does the operation and how good they are at it, you're going to see a tree hiccup. if you let a tree get into poor health from the sheen degrading and then you try to fix it. Being proactive about that, that is the way that you preserve the quality of the tree. And that's what we did with this tree. We did not allow it to start to go downhill. We saw a little bit of yellowing. Right now, this yellow, if you see any of the yellowing on this tree, it's on the margins. Probably something to do with maybe a potassium or an iron issue. Not a big deal. It's been strong. It's been healthy. We'll correct that. In fact, we're getting ready to drench with iron the next time that we touch this tree this week. So that'll be really probably something that's resolved relatively quickly. But when you start to see yellowing occur on a broader scale in an elm, that's a bad sign, right? We want to be very aware. That's a potential indication. Okay, now I'm working through these. I don't see anything that's kind of lopsided, but as I get up into this, notice what's happening here. This has started to change its position, and just a little tiny boom right there and boom right there. Those two create the kind of break and definition that complements the piece above it and complements the piece below it. Right now, this is undefined. One piece of wire, bing, and I'm done. Go with a, I can get that done with, I could probably get it done with the 12. If I have any doubt, I'm going to go with a 10, just so that I have that structural control.
Rodrigo asks, ulmus need huge amounts of nutrition to make that kind of ramification, right?
Yes.
That is not going to oversaturate the soil, is it?
Oversaturate the soil with what? Hit me back, Rodrigo. Oversaturate it with what? They need huge amounts of nutrition. If you give them the right nutrition, it only complements the soil, right? So when we're talking about that, is the huge amounts of nutrition, most of us are going to say, okay, well, I'm going to slam this thing full of nitrogen. I'm going to do it with copious quantities of a balanced fertilizer, and that's actually probably where elms get headed in the wrong direction, because when you treat an elm to get green growth, and I'm not saying that good balanced fertilizer doesn't give this to you. It will certainly, give it to you for a certain period of time, where you hit it with a balanced form of nutrition and you get good, strong green growth. But over the course of time, what ends up happening when you hit and continue to fertilize with a balanced NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer, is you start to get excesses of potassium. That's the one that can kind of accumulate and create some issues. And the thing about bonsai, and particularly the broadleaf deciduous model, is we are repotting broadleaf deciduous every, depending on your practice and fertilization and growth rate where you're at, probably repotting every 3-4 years. But on a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous like an elm, you don't want to be repotting that quickly, because a sheen-based tree, the reason this tolerated heat, a little bit more heat tolerant because of cuticle genetics, water mobility, we want to build up that sheen. And building up that sheen means leaving the tree in the container for a bit longer. And so that's where we can see that balanced fertilization start to cause some issue, right? So we would say, listen, over the spring season, kind of holding back on some potassium and treating with nitrogen, phosphorus, and calcium and trace elements, iron, and some of these other pieces. And then sort of as we move into this portion of the year, coming back with that balanced fertilization and giving a little bit of potassium. Moving into the fall, right? Small amounts of nitrogen. Less nitrogen over the fall is going to be better for your trees, and you'll start to see their behavior. Even a tree in an older container start to recover its green color. Okay? Just balancing that out. I have not pruned this at all, and I would say this is not of a density where I would even touch it. I look here. Okay, go ahead and bring me in tight, Josh. I look here. I look here. I look here. That looks great. Notice how dense this is, and look at this branch line. Bing, and then this one. Okay, this needs to be broken up. That needs to be broken up, and then this density needs to be reduced to balance with this. This is our first really strong area as we're working our way up the tree. Let me go ahead and come in and try to address this particular area and see if we can't balance it out a little bit, okay? So I've got this piece I'm going to drop down, which starts to isolate this piece up. Notice the space that's created here. I love that. I love, love, love that. I see this kind of bubble, this informality here. I'm going to have to decide. Probably some pruning to adjust this shape a little bit. I'm not so sure I like this piece where it dips and then forms that knuckle. We can come back in and correct that. Maybe we want to go ahead and wire that. I don't want to get into this mode of trying to wire too much, okay? So I'm just finding my moment. What is that moment? If I drop down here and I hit there, there it is, okay? Watch this, boom, boom, there it is. That gives me that nice spacing, and then I'm gonna prune. Okay, I'm gonna use 8 gauge to get that done because I've got 2 movements in that one piece of wire.
Dakota asks, do all or most elms need a sheen? And if so, do they need to be kept in slightly larger pots?
Okay, so when we say it's a sheen-based tree, elm historically is a species that needs a sheen. The exception to that is obviously going to be if you propagate elm from air layer, or if you start an elm at a very young age with a complete removal of the sheen or flat working those roots. Typically, that's not going to be an elm that has strength over the course of time. They need that. They need that root system under the trunk, because elm, if you ever dig into the roots of elm, even a regular Chinese elm, they're not your standard woody tissued roots. They're a little bit fleshy. This one in particular is almost like a succulent. It's like very, very, what would I say, corky? Fleshy, there we go. It's fleshy, very, very fleshy tissue. When I handle these roots, they'll break like a carrot almost. They'll break like a tuber, you know? Just kind of pop open. They don't tear, they don't bend, they're not woody, they're white inside. It's like a radish, okay? So when we start to look at that, those kind of odd behavior trees typically do tend to lean on a sheen, whereas you look at a trident maple, Japanese maple, it's like this nice, solid, woody root system. That sort of lends itself, a beech, a Stewardia, right? Lends itself to that kind of nature. We look at wisteria. Wisteria, again, starts to shift into a sheen base. It's a flowering fruiting. We understand that. Our flowering and fruiting varieties have fleshy, really odd root systems, okay? So you see this consistency. But when you have a sheen-based root system, more often than not, and I'm going to say, I can't say 100% of the time, but I could say basically 100% of the time. I can't tell you if there's I can't think of an exception, but obviously nothing is 100%. Almost 100% of the time, they're going to benefit from a deeper container, not a larger container. Okay, larger is too broad of a term. They're going to benefit from a deeper container, right? And that deeper container facilitates health of the sheen in terms of having that balance of water and oxygen, depth to move that excess water out so that the sheen gets oxygen. Sheen under the trunk, last place oxygen moves to, right? Also stays the wettest, gets the driest when it gets compact, least oxygen-rich area. We need that gravity pulling water through a slightly deeper container to be able to create the kind of environment under the trunk that facilitates a healthy sheen, and that's where the depth counts. Okay, and we're talking, we're not going to put it into a radically deep container. This is a pretty shallow container for a tree of this size, right? I think it aesthetically very much works for this. Okay, but we don't want to be trying to squeeze this into some sort of really ultra thin, wide container. That's not the aesthetic that we're looking for, okay? Just giving myself a little bit of space to play here, breaking it up, and I'm always, when I'm working through an area like this, trying to figure out where does my wire need to pass through all of these finer branches, and where does my wire need to hit to give me the impact that I'm looking for in terms of control, okay? Now, usually I don't carry a thick wire all the way out here, but I'm not super happy with the tip of this either, so I'm just gonna go ahead, I'm gonna come back to the base here, I'm gonna come back to the tip here just to try and get that distribution, and then I'm gonna reverse roll to try and gain some control here. And I like the informality that creates. I'm not trying to create rigidity, okay? I'm trying to create informality. Now, do I want this branch to be apart? Do I want this branch to leave? This is interesting, right? This branch can go, create a little bit of space. It also feels a little bit natural here. Can I directionally prune to just give this a little bit more of an upward direction? Let's see here, okay? Just a little slight adjustment, just a little touch, little tip. Okay, I've got a little bit of length in here. This one feels a little bit overly dense. overly dense because I've got some longer pieces that are overlapping some interior pieces. Let me just go ahead and take some of these back, get a little bit more of an elongation reduction here, and we should be good to go.
Paul asked, could you root that branch that you cut off as a cutting?
You certainly could. These trees, when we say they were mother stock for propagation, were mother stock for cutting propagation. So Yatsubusa and elms in general, fairly easy to strike as cuttings. It could be rooted. I don't know what the best time of year to be propagating elm is, but I'm certainly leaning towards a time of year where they have foliar mass on them. It's probably very possible to root that branch. I don't know for sure, and if you're asking me to do it and then send it to you, I won't. I love you, Paul, but I just won't do it.
Ricky Diaz, a question, says, the two branches on the right look like they are moving toward each other a bit. Is this by design, or do you need to rewire that area as well?
I don't know. Let's keep moving. Let's keep moving. This is the whole thing with broadleaf, is the work starts to dogpile on itself, right? So now that we've been making these decisions, we're starting to see where aspects of the foliar mass are starting to mass and create inconsistencies in density. We're seeing some of these, but you can't see it all. You can't see it all in the beginning because there's just too much to look at. It's like, how do you break into this? You have to start with a single gesture, and that single gesture creates another gesture, creates another gesture. So now we're all the way around kind of the bottom 30% of the tree, and we're starting to see some of the space. We're starting to see some of the definition. We're also starting to see some of the irregularities, okay? Now, we talked about this area right here being an area that felt like it had a little bit of an abnormality in shape, okay? And this is a fairly evolved and developed piece of growth right here that's just kind of popped up. I don't mind that. Let's look at it from the front. Again, follow it. It's all the way over there. And you kind of see that odd little, notice that little dip and that kind of gesture out. Now, I want you to pay attention to the clarity that exists through here. This is really quite beautiful now. We've cleaned all of this up. And I would say that the clarity and the definition through there, I don't want more tightness. I love what we've accomplished. Now, could I get nitpicky and try to drop this down? Yes, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to tighten it up to that degree, okay? I'm happy with this. I want to work on this a little bit more, and we've got to decide, okay, I'm going to work on this. I'm not quite happy with that. How are we going to work on that piece? Do we want to cut it off? No. We've worked so hard to try and accomplish what we're building over here that if I cut that off, I'm losing so much time and effort, and it's so easy to cut something off. It's so easy. Nobody is executing bonsai on a higher level who's coming in and saying, oh man, just cut that thing off. That's like not the move for high-level bonsai. I can take this down, I can directionally prune some of these pieces, I continue to keep that ramification, that structure. I'm just gonna go with a little bit of tin to give me the power at that very short tip. I'm gonna catch it right on its neighbor right here, nothing big. Okay, I've got a very rigid structural branch. This wire is not gonna overweight this and cause it to sag. Just a small little gesture right here.
Isaiah asked, what has been the biggest challenge for you with this tree?
I have to be quite honest. This tree has been nothing but a pleasure. I think there are other species of elms that I find to be far more, you know, when you talk about the Seiju, when you talk about a Hokkaido, when you talk about some of the other specialty varieties that are far more brittle, etc. You know, these are the ones that you start to look at and you start to go, I don't know how I feel about even trying to work with that. That's not the Yatsubusa. The Yatsubusa is an absolute masterpiece of a species from its behavior and characteristics. So I don't have any challenges that stand out where I'm like, oh man, you want to steer clear of Yatsubusa because of this. This is one of the varieties of elm in my mind, as far as just filled with potential, capable of so much.
Bentley asked, is guy wire okay for exhibition?
No. Nope, it's not.
Dalton said, what would you use as an accent plant for this tree?
Ooh, nice. Depends on what we're trying to create context around. Are we creating context around the fact that this is a Japanese variety or an Asian variety when we talk about parviflora? Are we talking about the fact that this originated in the Willamette Valley and has been 100% grown in North America? Okay, let me show you this. I think that's a dramatic improvement to that area. Just really soften. Notice how we soften that dip. See that contour of that upper piece, and then it kind of shoots out into that nice round lobe. I love that. That's the kind of changes I'm looking to make, okay? I think contextually, my biggest priority with this tree is not trying to create something too traditional, because this isn't a traditional elm. You wouldn't see an elm like this in Japan. It's not how it would be made. There are a lot of quote-unquote flaws that would have been removed. This looks like an elm though, you know, and if Dutch elm disease hadn't wiped out a majority of the grand old-growth elm in the northeastern United States and the Midwest, we would still be seeing elm of this caliber and this size and scale and age, but we don't have that reference anymore. This is very true to form, very, very true to form for elm. And again, I think Sergio's iteration is also very true to form and another sort of perspective of elm and how it occurs, okay? All right, so I feel good. I feel good through the midsection here. There is one little area right here that I want to point out. Okay, watch this. Watch, 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 watch. Look at that. Just notice how it's kind of forgotten and now it's in. Notice how big that space is, and you see the dead branch behind it. See that dead branch right there? Right there. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to cut that out come fall. I'm not going to cut that right now. I don't want to try and cut that and patch it and have that desiccate. I'm going to cut that in fall when the leaves drop, because there still is living tissue on it. I want to cut it and I want to patch it when it's reallocating resources. I'm going to leave that right now. Okay, but I'm going to bring this up not to hide the dead branch, but to elevate this piece into a more sustainable position. And that's going to kind of open up, what do we do with this piece? Let's take care of those two pieces right now. How are we doing on time?
7:30.
7:30, perfect.
Bentley has a question and says, sorry, I know you covered this, but in an elm in development, do you wire out all of the secondary branches?
Yes, yes, and that's, and I may not have covered it thoroughly because we're going in like, there's a lot that I want to tell you about elm. Proof is in the pudding. I have not seen many people build really, really mature, highly ramified, structurally sound, transition of taper, you know, natural design from a stump to a finished tree like this. I have not seen that happen at a high level very often. I'm not saying people aren't capable. I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I'm saying I just haven't seen it that much. So I feel like, hey, you know what? I feel very, very confident in this knowledge. Proof is in the pudding. This was a stump, and the majority of the branches were air layered off. It was incredible. It's an incredibly shocking transition in a very, very short period of time. And this is how I did it. I wired out the structure. I wired out the secondaries, right? I really put in that time early on this elm. That is the key to all broadleaf deciduous in my mind. Put in the time on the structure and that primary and secondary structure to get the scale, to get the transition of taper, to get your expansion of the foliar mass and branching mass that you're going to build the tertiaries on. Then you can come back and you can start really working the tertiary tips. Until that point though, once you're growing structure and secondaries, you're not pruning back to twos necessarily in the tertiary level. You're pruning back to twos on the secondary or the structural level to make sure you're not getting structural flaws, okay? Here's that elevated right there, okay? Take a look at that. Just brought up into that space. Notice how close it is to that dead branch behind it. Go ahead and bring me in tight here, okay? So I've elevated this up into that position there where we said, and now look, this piece, boom, now that fits in. It's in no branch land right now. Informally arranged, I don't like that, okay? I also struggle with this piece. How are we gonna handle that? Am I gonna drop this down and cut that line? That makes sense. Okay, so that might be the next gesture. Let's go ahead and reconcile this one first. This again is gonna be 10 gauge. I'm gonna roll this over just slightly just to get that little bit of motion. Okay, and you're starting to see the impact of just a few pieces of wire. So far, let me see, we've got 1, 2, 3, a little chipper there, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is going to be number 8. I'm guessing we go 15 pieces of wire. We'll see how close I get by the time we're done to wire this entire thing. But it's not without labor. It's not without deliberation. It's not without strategy. It's not without thought process. We don't want to be wiring if we don't have to, because that's what destroys the natural element of this maturity, this mochi-komi that we've created. You come in here, you wire this whole thing, or, you know, to Chuck's point in the very beginning, you come in and you start chopping off big structural pieces because they catch your eye or whatnot without seriously. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying branch removal can't improve a tree. It certainly can, okay? But you need to be completely informed on a mature, refined broadleaf deciduous before you cut a branch off, because you start to recognize, oh my gosh, what did I do? And that is the worst feeling in the world. That is the worst feeling in the world. I have watched that happen in a demonstration, the runaway train of momentum, where one branch got cut off and then another got cut off, and then all of a sudden the tree was destroyed, and that tree was cut all the way back to a stump as the final product of the demo. It was a finished broadleaf deciduous tree before the demo started. You know, you don't want to be that person. You don't want that to happen to your tree, okay? So we're going through this and we're saying, listen, the deliberation and the kind of pacing of the work to understand, okay, I've pruned all the stronger areas. Now I'm coming in here and I'm very, very deliberately handling the wire. I'm aware of my wire. I'm aware of where I've got to hit. My offhand is functioning absolutely impeccably, but I'm not trying to wire a ton. I'm trying to wire very little, and I'm trying to wire very strategic and very pointed areas. That's the way that we handle mature broadleaf deciduous. That's the way we handle mature broadleaf deciduous. There's no other way. There's no other way. You get them to this point and you start saying, oh, I'm just going to clip and grow. You can't clip and grow for forever. You got to do something. These trees are phototropic. Hey Josh, show us that. Show us that raw form of this tree real quick. I'm gonna swing it back. Yeah, bring that up. Okay, this is the initial structural setting after I had cut off all the air layers and put it into the original pot. That's the very beginning. Okay, now bring it back in studio. That was 2014, 2013 or 2014. Okay, so that's less than 10 years ago that we went from that to this. Go ahead and toggle back to that again. Okay, now just oscillate back and forth between these two images a couple times. Okay, do it again. Yeah, keep doing it. Yep, keep going. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes. Yes. One more. Yep, good. Okay. Whoo! Nice build. Nice bonsai. You make good bonsai. You make good bonsai. Okay. So now we see this bottom piece cleaned up. You see it? Oh, look at how it cuts that line, that branch line right there. You can see that. Watch, 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 watch. Front, boom, perfectly placed. I love it. I love it. And now you're starting, what's happening here is we're stacking on. We're stacking on the visual identity of this tree. We're setting a value standard for what this refined piece is going to look like. And we're saying, I accept this, but I didn't accept this or that. I accept this, but I didn't accept that, okay? And as we start to establish that, these things start to point themselves out. I can't accept that because I didn't accept it down here. Oh, okay. All right, that's the standard that we started to work towards. Let me go there now. Let me go there now. Let's work on this one here. This one is a little bit more complex, okay? Because it's not about trying to hide this line. It's about orienting the foliar mass and the stuff around it to make it blend in. I don't want this to be one big mass, but here's your move right here. Hey, Zeus, you looking over my shoulder? Hippity hop on in here. Let's see what we can do. Boom, right? Boom, boom. Okay? That's the move. Boom, boom. Right there. Okay, I still want this delineation here. I don't want this to be one homogeneous pad. If I drop this down, that becomes one homogeneous pad. Okay? And it's very, very blocky and thick. But if I leave this up, I go boom, boom right here, I have ding, ding. That tells me I have a soft, nice two-pad system right there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to wrap that up in a big bundle of 8 gauge.
Bentley has a question. Says, I collected some elms this spring. They don't have as much foliage as I'd like. Should I fertilize them?
Are they growing aggressively? Because if they're growing aggressively, I would say that is a good idea. you know, when you collect a tree and you say, I want you to have more leaves. First, you've got to build the roots to support the leaves. We haven't gone through the vascular build portion of the year yet. So to say, I want you to have more leaves, tree that I collected, but I haven't given you the time to produce the roots to support the leaves, what does growth say? If you speak bonsai to me, growth says, if a tree is growing, it's saying, I have enough to sustain and add. If a tree is not growing, it's saying, I just have enough to sustain. And if a tree is losing its foliage mass, it's saying, I don't have enough to sustain, okay? So by fertilization, is that going to be the thing that gets it to grow more foliage? No. The thing that's going to get a deciduous or a broadleaf tree to grow more foliage is growing roots over the fall that give it the resources to sustain and add. You're probably looking at next year before you get that tree to actually produce a vigorous amount of foliar mass, okay? Now, should you fertilize to help the tree metabolize? Light fertilization, if it's not growing with a balance of water and oxygen, probably does help supplement its resources to be able to produce vascular tissue over the fall. Should you be doing it right now in the peak heat of summer? No. No. Should you be expecting, if you fertilize, more foliar mass? Again, no. No. So my bonsai speak, you know, if I'm looking at the crystal ball of bonsai, you fertilize now, Bentley, I bet you see more harm than good. Okay, so we're gonna come up and in. Yes. Yes, already that's helping. And I'm going to go down and out. Boom. And boom. Okay, now that doesn't take that dog leg out of it, but it certainly softens it. Let's see. Let's see from the broader angle. Oh, I can do that. I can do that, Ira. Yeah, And I still want that length. Now, that's not necessarily the longest point, that point on the upper right. That's my longest point, okay? I love this. I love me some this, okay? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave that. Now, when I start to look at this here, there's two areas on the top that I have a big, big issue with, because the top is a little bit like, okay, watch this. Watch closely. Yes. Yes. Okay, and once I do this, then we start to say, uh-oh, right? And right there, okay? That just closes that canopy down. This, that's gnarly, okay? That's gonna be a 6 gauge on really, really rugged bark that can't touch anything improperly. That's gonna be the most technical wire that we put on this tree. We are rapidly approaching a really good place. I've flirted with this midsection here because look at how planular this is. This feels a little bit artificial to me right there. Notice that beeline right through the middle of that compared to all of the other really beautiful branching. I think this probably wants to come down into here. Okay, so maybe I'll start there. And that to me feels like I can elevate here and I can bring down there. That's a nice move. Let's do that first. Just because I'm being a little chicken about that big move up top. I'm delaying the inevitable. I'm prolonging it. I'm getting my courage up to do it because there's a risk of breakage. Not a high risk, but there is a risk of breakage on this next one.
Thomas has a question for you, and he says, are you wiring and pruning secondary and tertiary branches during this operation?
So at this level of refinement, I'm not pruning. Sorry, I'm just working through really, really fine ramification here. I'm not pruning many secondary branches. Okay, I've removed a couple of pieces that were a little too dense or weak or maybe causing some congestion aesthetically that I didn't necessarily find to be beautiful. But beyond that, I'm too far along in the refinement process to be necessarily doing secondary pruning. That's happened in several other sessions in multiple years prior to this. This is truly that tertiary. Now, again, having said that, it's unnecessary, it's overcrowded, or it's extremely weak. Great. Let's go ahead and prune it, okay? It's it's the wrong size, it's causing a structural flaw. All that stuff's been done. That's been done, okay? But you could be doing adjustments if you say are behind where we're at with your elm. You could be doing some of that work right now, right? It's not like it's against the law, but secondary work ultimately should have taken place earlier. If we're waiting until now to do secondary, it's probably caused some flaws already.
Bentley had a question and says, how do you keep the sheen when you collect an elm?
Well, elms are most likely going to be coming out of dirt, okay? And there's a big difference between like, oh, we're talking cedar elms coming out of caliche or something like that versus like this came out of a heavy clay environment where the roots were very close to the trunk. But you're starting at the drip line, and we did this when we did the urban Yamadori collection of the Pieris. That's what collection of elm ultimately is going to look like, is more of an urban Yamadori kind of section of work. But you're starting at that drip line, you're working underneath it, keeping it intact, popping it, and then you're being very careful when you transport it, wrapping it to secure the root system, keep the root ball intact, et cetera, et cetera. That would be how I do it. Now, if there's no roots underneath the sheen and that whole thing falls apart, well, there's no roots underneath the sheen and the whole thing fell apart. There's nothing that you can do about it. But the more intact the root ball stays on a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous, the higher your success rate, okay? Inevitably, beyond a shadow of a doubt, your success rate improves. Okay, let's see how that worked. Yeah, see, that just gives that a little bit of motion here. I could see coming into here just to drop that down and really separating. Go ahead and come in close for me there. See how I have this diagonal line here? That's worth the squeeze right there, okay? Just that little bit, take that diagonal. That diagonal can make, one diagonal line across the middle of the upper 30% of the trunk can make a tree feel like this, right? I don't want the tree to feel like that, and the way that I fix that is I drop that piece down, and all of a sudden I'm back to here, okay? Let me go ahead and hit that, and then we'll get that next big one.
Thomas has a question and says, my corkbark elm suffered sunburn 4 weeks ago. I put it into the shade to recover, dropped all of its leaves. Then it finally came back and it's more robust with growth. Can I still do this operation or should I be letting it recover?
A couple weeks ago, just produced a whole new flush of growth and it's robust. Should you do this? That is, I would say, a tall order, but hey, sometimes that shedding, treat that shedding as if you prune the tree. How about that? Treat that as if you treat it as if you've pruned the tree. And if you prune the tree and it responds again strongly, sometimes we can come back and we can prune a tree a second time. So I would say, you know, from that perspective, the strength of that growth, Thomas, and you've got to be honest with yourself, because if you lie to yourself, you can't lie to the tree. The tree doesn't have a credit card. If you cash in its energy system by trying to prune it twice when it wasn't strong enough to do so, it's going to tell you, and it's going to tell you by kicking the bucket or losing some very, very serious branches that are going to set you back way farther than if you were just patient. So you got to decide if it's showing you the kind of health that would make sense to go ahead and prune, okay?
Paul's following up on his question from earlier and says he guesses he should have been more specific. How large of a branch cutting for this would root? I love you too, Ryan, but a mailed cutting was not my motive. I have a corkbark elm at home. Was just curious about taking cuttings from it.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. Well, you'd be surprised, Paul, how many people have requested that we root something and send it to them when we cut a lot of foliage off of things. But touche. How big? Right circumstances, mist system to reduce transpiration. I bet you get a thumb size cutting to take pretty effortlessly with this species. You might even be able to get a wrist size cutting to take in abnormal circumstances, super high heat, high humidity, correct location and correct setup of propagation, bottom heat, right balance of water and oxygen, medium is on point, mist system that's not keeping the foliage or tree overly saturated. You could probably get a very thick cutting to take. I've seen crazy things happen. I've seen crazy things happen with the right systems and the right setup. I couldn't and wouldn't universally say, oh man, you get a wrist-sized cutting to take all day. That's never gonna happen, right? But you could have an exception to that circumstance, especially if the tree is very strong and it goes straight into a circumstance like that. Trident maples are notorious for that. I've seen certain varieties of oak be able to be flat cut. Obviously, olives are the most common sort of broadleaf species that we can completely flat cut and get to root from virtually no root system whatsoever. But when we talk about broadleaf deciduous with their high water mobility, that is a little bit of a quirk, and we've got to supplement that loss of water. They do generate sugars and starches rapidly if you keep the foliage mass hydrated. They will take in, this is the thing, like an open straw, they will take water in through that open cut site, and that's really where you have the ability for a very short period of time to kind of capture that action. Okay, I'm just gonna secure that right here, just for a moment, okay? And I'm gonna take it off once we get through this. This is kind of going through the heart of ramification, which I don't, if I can avoid it, I don't like to be wiring up in here, but again, this isn't about what we like and don't like. This is about what makes the best tree. 6 gauge on a highly ramified, tiny little leaf tree is not my idea of how I like to party, but I'll party this way if we have to. Okay. All right, here we go. Go ahead and I'm gonna grab that. Okay, now, here comes proof is in the pudding. I don't want to see that. And it doesn't move. Hey. There we go. Drop that down. Okay. Fills that space. Cuts that obvious discrepancy and transition of taper. Creates some opportunity. Now watch this. This is what I was looking at as we were talking about cuttings. Watch this. Okay, because we have a relatively flat pad. Tell me if this improves it. Okay, let me go again. Tell me if this improves it. I don't know that it does. Let me see if I can get my arm in here where we can see it without me. Ooh. Yeah, it gives it, but does it? Now watch closely, because I think a lot of us are saying, oh, yeah. Watch closely. We go up, boom, boom, boom. Too repetitious. Notice size. Boom, boom, boom. Trio, watch. Better down, huh? Better down. Ooh! Came dangerously close to applying a piece of wire, and this is again where deliberation is so important. You apply a piece of wire, you go through all that trouble, you're gonna damage something in that process, I guarantee it. Bark, branches, leaves, etc. And then all of a sudden you put it up there and you're like, oh man, that looks like a pom-pom. That looks like I just decreased the quality of the tree. Okay, I'm gonna say that we leave it down. I do think we have a moment here. Where we can just spread a little bit in this direction, give myself a little bit of distribution, and then here's the biggie, right there. That's the one, okay? Let's go ahead and take a look through the back, see what we got here. I love this. I love this spacing. I like what we have happening here. I do feel like there might be right here, okay? See how this is becoming so big? That's a move. I think that's a move that has to be made. Notice how straight, how that whole branch from back here is super straight, and then you just go bing right there. That's a nice move. And then we can just go boop, take those bottoms off, and you've completely reformed it. Let's go ahead and get that real quick. I'll get that with 8 gauge, and then we'll finish off with the apex. I think we are dangerously close. And I say dangerously close because we'll probably find another really complicated piece that just cannot be lived without being wired.
Yeah, we were getting some feedback on that last section that after you do the apex, it might be worth looking back at that move again.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think that's intelligent. And again, this is the process. Nobody's out there nobody's out there saying, hey, this is how you go about handling a hyper-refined broadleaf deciduous tree. This is how you go about making decisions. This is the process. You prune it, you do the refinement on the stronger areas, you come back. Okay, let me just, okay. And then I see here I have an opportunity to just get a little bit of a spread here, so let me catch that. Just go here, okay. And I'm gonna come back. Okay, my motivation with this is to prevent, because we can inherit, you know, I mean, Ann Spencer from the Portland Bonsai Society was one of the best broadleaf deciduous practitioners in North America. Most people probably don't know who Ann Spencer was, but in the Pacific Northwest, Ann Spencer was a legend. She had a birth certificate for every one of her trees that was a picture of it as a seedling or a cutting or an air layer. She took copious notes. She took copious pictures as they evolved. Some of Michael Hagedorn's really good deciduous trees came from Ann Spencer. The whole Portland community has them. You see an Ann Spencer tree, you immediately know it. She was just phenomenal with the broadleaf deciduous capacity. And how do you take that tree and perpetuate that quality? How do you handle it? How do you look to style it? How do you make decisions about adjusting it? That's the whole purpose of this conversation tonight. Okay, seems like an outlier here. Seems like an outlier, feels a little bit long to me. Do we try and wire this? If we wire it down, it sort of homogenizes that plane. So having it up is nice. I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna drop off just a little bit of this length. Okay, and that helps just a little bit. I still feel like I've got a little bit more that can come off of this just to kind of limit that. But we gotta be careful, okay? We gotta be careful because you start making prunes that start to feel good, that start to look better, and you start to say, oh, yes, yes, and then I'm gonna prune more, and I'm gonna remove here, and I'm gonna wire more. That's the momentum that you're trying to stop. That's the momentum that you're trying to stop, okay? That's all I wanna do there, just to push it back a little bit, just to hold it in that position. Okay, let's keep going. Going. Okay, now, in this area right here, there's probably a little bit. This is that dead branch that I'm gonna wait. Again, there's living tissue around it. The interior here has some life. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm just gonna shorten just a little bit of this. It's getting a little bit unwieldy and out of control. I don't want to disempower this area. I wanna leave more leaf mass on than I think. I've got some branches that are kind of overlapping here. Let me take that out. Okay, but I wonder if we need to go ahead and just kind of push this. In fact, not wonder, we do need to push that down. I need to get it free of this space. Eventually, this is probably gonna become, and if we find this to be of value, this would be an area where we would say, gosh, should we move this out of the way towards this? Now it's underneath here. This is a challenging space. This is a really challenging space to be working in because we've got this piece here, which is a great structural. If we cut it off, we just have a single branch up to the tip. So we know we want this. I know I want this, but it's overwhelming this piece being a very, very important piece. But then maybe we start to say, man, I could just cut this whole piece off right there, open up space, drop this into that space and have far more sustainability because this is already weak. That's probably the move. That's probably the move that would elevate the level of this tree the most. Now, again, I'm not gonna do that right now. I'm not gonna do that right now because cutting off right here, right now, and taking off this apex, okay? Taking off this piece. If I do that, I'm gonna get dieback down this trunk. I would wanna do that, cut it, leaving a stub, and then in the fall, as the leaves drop, cut it, leaving a stub, and come back and clean it up the following year. That's the move to get the collar, to avoid the dieback. Elm has a notorious capacity to die back, okay? So we've set our plan up for that. I'm fine. I'm not gonna adjust this until that's been moved, okay? I know I'm exhibiting it. They both occupy a beautiful space. I'm okay with that. That'll have to come in the future, okay? But now we're into this area here where we've got a nice setup and we're in the apical region. Let's go ahead and let's tackle this apex. It's time, okay? I'm gonna hit here. I'm gonna hit here. Boom, boom. Feels like that's gonna broaden everything significantly. And then we're gonna reassess. That's gonna tighten it up too much. Let me show you this real quick. Okay, and I'm gonna go to the 3/4 cam. Lonnie, you wanna grab that apex real quick? Okay, this is tempting right here. It's tempting to drop that down. It's part of this branch below it. It's part of this branch right here. Okay, see it where it is, drop it down. See it where it is, drop it down. Now that's a huge, huge change because this branch up here is not as dense as everywhere else. So leaving that there where it contributes to the density right here, as opposed to losing that, see that space that opens up? This is also a part of broadleaf deciduous work. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna leave that right where it's at. Okay, 2 pieces of wire. This takes us up to number 15, if this is where we end. That's amazing. It's like I've done it before. This is the worst. What do you got for me, Ira?
Matt has a question. This is from a little bit earlier and said, can we see it rotate slightly to viewer left? Does that lowest branch on the right have more of a presence and line? Just trying to see the front slightly move. Not certain. Just saw something when you were rotating.
Okay. We'll have to come back to that one.
That may not be the best time for that question.
I will have to come back to that one. I appreciate it, though. Thank you.
We'll come back to that. Dalton asked, how accepted or common is it to use one species of tree to show the form of another, like Chinese Elm Bonsai to show the American elm form, or Thuya occidentalis bonsai for Thuya plicata?
Oh, well, I think Thuya has some commonalities of growth habit that allow you to tap into Thuya as a variety, foliar presentation, circumstances that occur in the native environment, etc. Right? So with the Thuya, I feel like, oh man, well, I don't know that you're diversifying Thuya plicata from Thuya occidentalis necessarily, or needing to do so necessarily. Okay? When you start to talk about the elms, I think you're starting to talk about showing elm in terms of age. Right now, I think areas that have more heat-driven elms, like the cedar elm in Texas, this has a very unique and diversified shape from Chinese elm or the American elm, right? But Chinese elm as a full-grown elm and the American elm, I don't know that they have a significantly different aesthetic to them, okay? But I think this question does have significance. Oh, that was awesome. That was awesome. Wow, let's show you that, okay? Ooh, that closed that gap right there, huh? That was nice. I don't even know that we need this one now. Let me just show you what that looks like. Okay, it almost rounds out the apex too much. Having that break right there, or closing that break. Having that break, or closing that break. What do you think? I'd be curious to know. That locked in right there as if it was always meant to be where it belonged. Let me know what you think of that other one. Now, you know, we talk about the boxwood. Boxwood is a shrub, primarily when we look at the, you know, native North American-born boxwoods, the Kingsville or something like that. You start to talk about it's a complete shrub, and we can use those to represent, you know, live oaks in the southeastern United States. That's where Rodney Clement's concept for the species comes from. And they do that very well in a miniaturized form. I don't have a problem with that. You know, it's representing a tree form. Would I want to use an elm to represent a pine tree or a trident maple to represent a pine tree? I think that's where you start to step into challenging areas, right? I mean, we use Satsuki azalea, which will never look like a tree. They're little round shrubs, or rhododendrons, big round shrubs, right? Yet we form a tree out of them to use their flowers, their small leaves, their beautiful silky smooth trunk, and we're okay with that. I don't know. I don't know where you orient with that, but I personally feel like, hey, as long as we're using a broadleaf tree to reflect a broadleaf form, a coniferous tree to reflect a coniferous form, I'm able to stay in the fight. It's when we use a coniferous form to make a broadleaf, or a broadleaf form, or a broadleaf tree to make a coniferous form, that I think you cross the boundary from my value system as a bonsai practitioner. Okay? What do they think? Leave it separate?
Almost everybody's saying nice break, leave it where it is.
Yeah, I think so.
I would say a few people were on the other side, but I would say most are keep it the way you got it.
Okay, fair enough. I don't know that it gets any better than this. This is by far and away the best this tree has ever looked in terms of distribution, pruning, health, ramification, and now it's all wired out. There is one area on the back here, feels like the apex. Look at that kind of raised section. You see that on the upper apical region? Right there, that kind of raised section. Now I want to go ahead and show you from the front. Okay, let me orient you from the front, and then let me go ahead and pull this down, because this might be another one of these tricky little areas. And let me grab in here. Does that make it better? Doesn't really impact it from the front, does it? But it certainly would improve the tree from the back. That is a change that I am unfortunately going to have to make.
Does that help with the density of that lower branch right below it where the branch secondary came up?
It's the move. It's by far the obvious move. And it's 2 more pieces of wire. Now we're going to go to 16 pieces of wire. I thought I had it nailed.
Unbelievable.
Is what it is. What it is. Is what it is. Yeah. Okay. Well, shogunai.
Matt has a question to clarify timing for development and secondary work. Should that be done at the same time as other broadleaf deciduous trees, or is this more a specific nuance for elms and or small leaf varieties that are in refinement?
So the refinement is doing it later, right? The structural work in terms of structural flaws, the accomplishing structural goals and transitioning from tip to interior, I would say that that is a pretty universal time frame that we're looking to do that in for most of our broadleaf deciduous species, small leaf, medium leaf, or large leaf varieties. I would say that that's universal, okay? As far as secondaries, I would also say the secondaries is pretty universal. What we see when we deal with smaller leaf varieties is for the refinement phase, when we have the energy so distributed across so many tips and a high level of refinement, what we start to see is we see that it takes them longer to create the leaf mass and generate the kind of growth across that copious number of branch tips to regain that energy and be in a position where we can prune them and plan on that ramification generating a second flush of nice, tight, viable pieces of woody twigging that will mature and turn into bifurcation between now and the fall. You do it too early and the tree just simply doesn't have the energy to push again. That's what we want to be super duper careful with. And that's why we let a species like elm, which is very heat tolerant, very accommodating of summer conditions. That's why we let it grow for longer, amass that energy in that smaller leaf, and then we come back and we perform the work, okay? So I would say that refinement notion is a nuance. The secondary and the structural pruning moments, those are pretty universal, right? Because we would say, hey, listen, Japanese maple, and we did the secondary work on the Japanese maple. That's the fastest one that we would do, and we did that almost a month after we did the tertiary work on the Japanese maple this spring. It's in the library, right? When we're starting to talk about all of our more aggressive pieces of work on the secondary, tertiary level, Ira is just doing some of the work on his, or did them in the past few weeks, some of the developmental secondary work on his deciduous pieces, on his tridents, on his wisterias, on some of those that aren't necessarily in refinement. And I think he nailed it. I think he nailed the timing perfectly because he got the piece, the thickening, the developmental goals, he got the length, he got the healing accomplished, transition from the tip, and we still have time for a foliar push and a reallocation of energy to regenerate that leaf mass. That's the key. We wait too long in the live Q&As. There's a sort of a cyclical discussion of you're pushing the boundary of the time frame to prune and get another flush of leaves to push before the tree moves into vascular productivity. If we wait and we bump up against that time frame too close, and we're really, this is for elm, I feel very comfortable with this tree that we're going to be just fine, especially because we're entering our warmest period of the year. Okay, but for a lot of our other species, I would say you're on the cusp. You're on the cusp. We're comfortable with the refinement of an elm. We're on the cusp for a lot of different species. Okay, one more. was gonna celebrate that last wire, and then I saw that when we rotated in camera, and I thought, well, that's unfortunate now, isn't it? Because now I have to put structural wire. This is, I have to put it through all of this ramification that forms this nice dense crown, and everybody's saying, gosh, you could have just left it, and I'm saying maybe I shouldn't have even drawn attention to it, but I wouldn't feel good about myself because I know that you're watching, keeping track of me out there, making sure that I'm practicing what I preach.
Kim has a question. If you could clarify the timing for structural pruning of Chinese elm.
Structural pruning of Chinese elm. Structural pruning, if we're saying I've accomplished my structural goals and I want to transition my Chinese elm into secondary, we would have pruned our Chinese elms a month ago. Pruned our Chinese elms a month ago.
Is that structural pruning timing a month ago?
So I'm not talking about big structural branch reduction, right? When I say structural pruning, I'm saying this branch has elongated, this branch has thickened, this branch has healed this wound, and now I'm gonna cut it back and I'm gonna let it push out a strong flush of secondary growth, right? That's the transition. Developmental, from the trunk, developmental branch, growing, 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 thickening, elongating, healing, expanding foliar mass, or recuperating the root system, right? Any of those things. We've accomplished that goal. We cut where we want that length. It's gonna push out strong, vigorous growth. It's got plenty of time to elongate into good secondary branching, and probably next year over the spring, we let that continue to grow into longer, thicker secondary branching, and we would come back and prune right around a similar time between 4 weeks ago and the refinement pruning now is your secondary pruning to select, to adjust 3s and 4s down to 2s. I want to keep the strongest one. Maybe I elongate, maybe it's the right size. Boom, I cut that at that point and it starts to produce tertiary, right? So that's your transition that you're looking for.
Paul asked if you could describe how to remove moss from the bark.
I will do so in just 1 second. Where are you? There you are. There's 5 million branches in this very last one that I'm trying to miss and not destroy as I'm wiring it. And we got it. And we got it.
Thread the needle.
Thread the needle. Hold.
Stay on target.
Hold. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1 second. Fire, fire, fire. Got it. Okay, that was, the last wire was the worst one, by far. Far and away the worst one. Okay, look at how that changed the back of that though. That was worth the squeeze, huh? What's that? This. What are you doing there? What are you doing in there? There we go. Love it. I love it. Oh, freaking awesome. Okay, what was the, there were a few questions that were happening there that were a little bit, that I just couldn't quite get to.
Yeah, we'll circle back on a couple of them. The last one was, please ask Ryan how to remove moss from bark.
Yeah. Okay, best way to remove moss, take a trash bag, cut it in half, lay it over the surface as tight to the trunk as possible. Take a spray bottle, fill it with vinegar. Come in here with the spray bottle, protect the leaves. Spray that. You cannot overspray on the leaves, right? Ideally, you would wet the leaves before you would do it with a spray bottle, but you don't want to moisten the moss because it'll dilute the vinegar. I do it in the wintertime to have the best results, but it's the vinegars in the spray bottle. You don't want it in the soil. You don't want it on live leaf mass. That is the very best way to get rid of moss in the bark. And we treat these every single year. We still get a little bit of growth. You probably saw a little bit of moss in some of the crotches and whatnot where it's kind of dark and dank on the inside here. We'll get some moss. It tends to dry out. There you go. You kind of see some of it. it tends to dry out in the summertime and really stops the decay of the bark. We don't water the foliage, we don't water the trunk of this, which helps with that moss not perpetuating the decay over this time. And then once it drops its leaves, we'll hit it usually one time in the fall and then one time in the spring before it pushes. The moss will dry out. We keep it indoors, typically the greenhouse where it's still cold. Moss will dry out. We can either remove it or we can just sort of let it fall away from the tree. But that's an annual maintenance thing that we perform on our really rough bark broadleaf deciduous. And even on some of our conifers, you know, the pines get lichen. I really like the lichen. Lichen will break down bark just like moss will, just more slowly. It adds age. You know, you can decide how you feel about lichen, but certainly high water retentive, very organically decomposing moss will take big heavy chunks of bark off of your trees very effortlessly. It's best to maintain that.
And quick follow-up from Chuck. He said the bark on the base of his corkbark elm develops some black mold. Is it the same technique which you'd recommend with the vinegar spray to remove that?
Some black mold. Any of the biology on the bark I would treat with vinegar, but be careful that it does not get in the soil, right? That's the key. So if you're treating around the base, you can also paint it with a paintbrush. If you need to be more concise and careful, as if you were painting deadwood with lime sulfur, which you don't want in the container, you don't want that vinegar, you could always do that. If you can cover it enough, you can spray it, and it will rectify the biology, to be sure. Let it dry out before you water it. Don't stick it back out in the rain where all that vinegar is going to wash into the container, or you'll see a tree do really weird things and potentially lose some portions of the tree.
And circling back on Matt's from earlier, he had asked if we could see the tree rotate slightly to viewer left if that lower branch on the right-hand side has more of a presence and line by doing that. He was just curious when he saw it rotating earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not mad at that. Viewer, rotate it to viewer left. So this is viewer, we're looking at the corner of the left, and then there's also this one if you wanted to see that. Okay, and I don't think it has more of a presence there. I like to see all of the lines. So notice this is the front of the tree. Let me show you the front on Lonnie's cam here. Okay, this is the front as it stands. Notice that all of the lines have space between the trunk and the lines. Notice on the left side of the trunk, you have that straight one that Chuck was talking about. Right side, you've got that apex that we're probably eventually going to shorten. You see all the branches. Okay, if I boost here, I kind of cover up that rear line, right? You see that dead branch sticking out of that space on the right-hand side of the trunk. I'm not mad at that. I think that's beautiful. It does tend to give the apex a little bit more movement, which change of direction right there, which is nice, and it kind of nullifies that straight line. I could get into that if it didn't hide some of the lines on the right side. And then if we go here, it hides that straight line and kind of changes the dynamic right in here, right? Changes that dynamic pretty significantly. I think there's room with this tree. It will continue to evolve. This is the thing that we certainly know about broadleaf deciduous and bonsai in general is, you know, some of these branches might die over the course of time if we have missteps in nutrition, repotting, pruning. I'll be super honest with you. When we got that April snowfall, which if you didn't see it on the news or you didn't hear us talk about it, all of the deciduous trees in the garden were in leaf. And we got 12 inches of the heaviest, wettest snow that I've ever seen, that I've ever seen in my life, actually. Let me just be very clear about that. All of the Yatsubusa elms and the corkbark elms were in the new deciduous garden, and I had a hornbeam landscape tree, big, huge hornbeam landscape tree, and that snow ripped every branch from top to bottom off. It was just a single cylinder of a trunk, and all of those branches fell smack dab on top of all of the elms. And then the snow on this tree, because of the density of the ramification, I cannot believe it did not rip this tree limb from limb. But when I picked the snow off of it, there was a noticeable susceptibility. I touched it and the branches started to move like this, and I was like, oh man, this tree was 1 inch away from being completely denuded of branches. That stuff is gonna happen in the extremes that we're experiencing in the modern world, in the modern climate. The more that we identify them and proactive we are, hopefully the less damage it does. But should those things happen, we have options with this tree.
And then quick one from Thomas. Will the bark slip if you bend the branches right now?
We should be past that point right now. We should be far past that point. Junipers are solidifying, which is why we're starting to work on them. Our deciduous should be fully distributed in terms of the sugar starch load being evenly distributed cell to cell, which is what reduces that sort of wetness of the xylem and the slippage of the cambium. We should be past that point on all of our species by this point in the season.
The last one I've got, Bentley and David both were asking about propping up the other branch up to take a look at that. This is the one.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Just
Yep.
foliage pad to
here we
the
go.
left of the apical region you were looking at moving.
Oh, see, that's... Go ahead and give me the wide again, Josh. Yeah, now it's really... But I don't know. I see... It does break up a very solid mass there, doesn't it? God, that's tempting, isn't it?
It gives you a little break on the far left side of it, too.
It's pretty big and flat right here. And then we just go, oh, gosh, I almost feel like we need to do that now. Yeah, okay, all right. It is what it is. I'm glad we came back to that. Thanks for reminding me. Maybe we can end on this not being the worst of all branches to wire. No, this one's gonna suck too. This is gonna be really bad. We've come this far though, right? And this is kind of what happens with broadleaf deciduous. And then you get in there and you're like, God, I'm like so close. Do I really? How much does it improve it? It's like, no, you can't do that. If it improves it, you have to do it. That's how you continue to increase the quality. If you start becoming, there is like a fear factor, there's a technical limitation, there's I would say just a downright sort of lack of dogged determination to make your best tree that can impair these final operations, okay? Don't let that be the limit to how far you can go in bonsai. Don't allow, technical limitations are conquerable. You learn by doing with bonsai. The tactile experience with the education, we're giving you the education. Look, we're gonna be giving you even more education here pretty soon, okay? We're giving that to you. We're taking away that limitation. Don't let that be. Okay, now there's a light lift. Is that enough of a lift is the question. Is that enough of a lift? That gives you a nice subtle, let's just see, do you want more subtle? More?
There were some comments about not going up quite as far as you had shown, so that subtle might be a winner, but let us know what you guys think.
Yeah, give me the feedback. I'm kind of getting in here into some less than awesome wiring grounds. Splitting some areas of fine branching. I'm having to. Okay, and if I'm gonna go up, my tip is most likely going to need to come down. So let me just finish my wire.
Pretty fairly split, maybe subtle has a little bit more feedback so far.
Okay, and then let me just go ahead and come in here and do a little bit of work. How does that resonate?
I've got Dalton saying, I like the lift, but I think a storm would eat that branch for dinner on the big tree. Subtle fits the canopy enough to be protected.
Yeah, right.
Also, a couple comments. I think most people are leaning towards subtle. There were some people that said if it was too subtle, it would look too much too much similarity with the branches to the left.
I mean, but that, you know, this was all flat, just keep in mind, and now we've got that lift and that lift, and if it looks like it's very nice and soft, then that's the broadleaf deciduous model. You don't want some dramatic, it's gotta fit in. It's gotta fit in, and I think that fits in beautifully. I think that was a wonderful call to finish the design and elevate, Ira.
I'm into it.
Yeah, you're into it. That was very flat there. I agree. They had kind of homogeneously, and now, you know, you have this nice, beautiful break. This sort of elevates this. The branches underneath it can exist in I think, a higher degree of health and refinability. I think the whole thing was a good proposition. Well executed.
In the 3D, that back branch just above where your hand is right now looks pretty nice too. I think there's a little more presence there with that branch.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it was the move. I think it was the move. You know, so here's the thing is, now that we've gone through this, come to the Pacific Bonsai Expo. Let's do it, you know, come see this tree in person. This is a really, really impressive tree to take in. Anybody who comes to Mirai and sees this is like, whoa, whoa, because it is a true blue reflection of an elm. I mean, you can't, it's undeniable, nature in miniature.
We're all caught up on questions.
All caught up. Oh, man. I'm excited that we got to do it. You've got the backbone of pruning. We've broken down timing to a significant degree, and hopefully it makes sense, right? And again, it's a little bit of a reverse order from, say, a high water mobility, non-sheen-based Japanese maple to the Chinese elm, but I think you understand why, and it's based on that leaf size and behavior, okay? But the bigger thing that we covered that I was excited and wanted to do live was the wiring process, because that's really where we start to cross these thresholds of wire and this notion of dictatorial control. Well, when we start to create this natural effect and we get all of this work built up, how do you handle that? It is a structural adjustment for the most part. We had one tic-tac wire in here, maybe two, one in the front, one in the back. The rest of these were structural moves to change big orientations, adjust space, positive and negative, and use that wiring to answer the question of those weaker areas so we can follow through with the pruning and make sure that we've evenly distributed that strength and density across the tree.
Is there a possibility, Mr. Sales, to show a before and after of this one, since we've gone through so much?
Oh yeah, interesting. You want that before? Or do you want the before of today? Show us that one first. This will never get old for me. There it is, unpruned. Bam. Okay, hang on, before you transition, notice the apex, notice the upper left side of the canopy, notice the spacing between the branches on the right and on the left. Okay, now bring us back. Definition, division, clarity, cleanliness. Really, 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 really good work. You know, not to pat myself on the back, but hey, pretty awesome tree, right? Not too bad. And in the process, we all get to benefit and learn from it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. Thanks for tuning in. This was one that I've wanted to do for a long time. We've done some elm work before, but not on this level and not with this capacity, specifically in the wiring process of a highly refined broadleaf deciduous. Huge check off the list of things that I wanted to be able to communicate via Mirai Live. Hot here, gonna hit high 90s next week. We're in the high 80s this week. This is the growing time of the year. This is when things really happen for us. They can go dramatically wrong if we're not on point. They can go dramatically right if we've got our ducks in a row. One thing I did over the weekend and on Monday, I went through with a vacuum through the entire garden, any tree that had compacted surface soil. Tweezers just cleaning up down to solid intact soil particles, vacuum it up, fill it with fresh soil, top dress it. Big action that we can perform at this time of year to keep that oxygen flowing, that water flowing, and keep our trees in peak health. Love you guys. Have a good rest of your week. We'll see you on the Q&As. If not, the mountain hemlock, secondary, tertiary wiring is done to the top. We're gonna finish it off next week live. Join us to bring that design to finality as well. We'll be here doing our thing. Love you.